Welcome back to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And this is the place where we search for theories that are going to change the world. We talk about history, we talk about economics, we talk about physics, we talk about consciousness. All theories are welcome. One of the things that we have discovered through our explorations of these kind of out there theories is that changing people's minds is extraordinarily difficult. There is an almost complete acceptance inside of academic circles, inside of, I would say, mainstream circles, that the ideas that are currently popular are in fact the correct ideas. And so we've been obsessed with this question for a really long time, which is, how do you actually change people's minds? If they're going along and whatever theory they're using is already working for them, is there any hope that they're going to suddenly see the world in a radical new way? Or is science and all other disciplines going to progress one funeral at a time, like Max Planck said? I really don't want to believe that you have to wait for the older generation to pass before people's minds are going to change. And so we're searching for people who can help us understand how to unstick various disciplines. Like, what are the cognitive tools that we have available to us to really radically transform the way that we see the world without radically destroying the people who see it the old way?
And at the same time, a huge problem with all of these disciplines is that they lack vision. They don't necessarily know where they're headed. You know, when it comes to something like fundamental physics, the goal was originally to understand how nature mechanically enacted all of its magic. But it became this indebtedness to the gods and the titans of physics and their brilliant mathematical abstractions, to the point that there is no vision for where this leads to ultimately. And the same thing plays out in theoretical space after theoretical space. And so not only how do we get unstuck, but how do we cultivate vision as a culture? How do we create a culture in these disciplines of seeing things new for the first time? And so today's conversation is a really interesting look at a tool for achieving vision, for achieving plasticity and openness to new ideas.
And for the conversation, we have with us Rick Doblin, who is the president of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. That is a mouthful, and I'm glad that I got it only on the second time.
So one of the cool things MAPS has been looking into is the use of certain pharmaceutical agents like MDMA to get people through conflicts that they have with one another, which seems obvious when it comes to, couples and marriages, but what about that idea as applied to institutional stuckness?
And so we cover the principles of how this therapy works, what kinds of things you can accomplish with it, whether or not it could actually get physics unstuck. We hear a lot about Rick's work in the field and everything that he has figured out over the course of many decades of trying to get something that is a radically transformative substance to have widespread acceptance in a culture that's like kind of weird and squidgy about pharmaceuticals or pharmacological agents that are not well within the triumvirate of like alcohol, cigarettes, and antidepressants.
We're all coming up in the aftermath of the war on drugs, which is a complete disaster. And so there's just a little bit of aimlessness culturally, a sort of confusion and ambivalence about a lot of these ideas that needs to be sorted out. And ultimately, I think that it trickles down into all of these other spaces that we care so much about as well. And that's why I think you guys are going to love this conversation.
Before we get to the conversation, two announcements. Number one is that we have Paradigm Drift recording tomorrow, August 4th at 7 p.m. If you want to participate, you have literally a little bit more than 24 hours to get signed up. So the way that it works is that we collect people that have theories all month long. Monday night, August 4th at 7 p.m. Pacific, we all get together in a public meeting room. We draw names out of a hat. Those who get drawn have 60 seconds to present their theories. Then we interview them. We give you ideas for how to improve them. We ask you how it is that you came up with this. We're trying to provide a public service for the world where theorists of all stripes have the opportunity to get their ideas out and to make them a little bit better.
And if we love your idea, maybe we'll invite you back next time to present a little bit more without having to sign up. And if it It's an incredible, freaking awesome idea. Maybe we'll get you on the podcast for a full 3 hours.
Indeed. And then if you enjoy the podcast, if you like what we do, I would really, really strongly recommend that you come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and sign up to be a patron. Somebody the other day told me that they were no longer a patron because they felt cheap signing up at the lowest tier. And so I wish to announce to the world right this second, do not feel that way. Please.
There are extremely high tiers as well. If you have thousands of dollars burning holes in your pockets, we will put them to use, I promise. We have a budget laid out. We can tell you exactly what we'll do with your money to make this project fly into the next atmospheric level, the stratosphere. Yeah, we need you. Anyways, we work directly.
The next quantum leap.
The next quantum leap. There you go. Yeah, remember, so we work directly for you guys. That's really, really important to this project, and we want to keep it that way. So do come over and check it out. And anyways, you can come and hang out with us once a week if you join Patreon. We have a meeting, and I love seeing you guys every week. So thank you if you're already a patron. It means the world to us.
Absolutely. And if you only have 75 cents a week burning a hole in your pocket, we would love to see you there. So
everybody hates coins, so get rid of them.
We should make a P.O. box so people can just mail us their coins.
Coin jar. One of those fountains maybe in front of the house.
Apparently the Trevi fountain in Italy makes millions of dollars a year from tourists throwing their coins into it.
Perfect. Let's set one up. All right, guys. Enjoy the conversation with Rick, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
When we talked to you previously, and everything that I've read about maps and what Rick Doblin has been doing for so long, it has to do with this mission to help people live more connected lives that are not affected by deep-seated traumas. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very spiritual mission. And we talk about it usually in terms of helping people that have post-traumatic stress disorder from, abuse or exposure to war or various other,
healing relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But we talk about like the PTSD and the trauma as having come from these like very significant events. And so that MDMA therapy can heal the traumas that arise from this. And something that we've discovered as we've been exploring physics is that there seems to be a very deeply traumatized response among scientists when it comes to encountering new ideas and playing with them.
That's so opposite of what you think science is about.
It
really is, and that's the sort of disturbing part when you come up through the pipeline and train to become a scientist, and you slowly have that hope kind of crushed out of your soul because you realize that it's gonna be this very conservative path where you need to find some tiny little niche to tack on some details to what came before you, and the best way to get a secured career is to study the things that are really safe and have already been well demonstrated. And you just kind of add some details. And the problem is, every once in a while, we all kind of know this has been written about in terms of paradigm shifts in the past, but revolutions happen, right? So the fundamentals, sometimes we go down the wrong sucker trail with a really big idea and it works out for a while, but it breaks eventually. And then people have a really hard time facing the music.
The rupture. They have a hard time wrapping their head around the fact that they might be on the front end of a rupture. And I wonder if something like psychedelics and something like MDMA couldn't help even scientists that are dealing with questions of, what is the nature of charge? Were we wrong about quantum physics? Is it possible that black holes don't exist? Are our models for stars completely incorrect? Like it feels...
Let me give like a concrete example. So we just held this conference in Portugal, and several times during the event, a scientist would present an idea that was in some ways one of these ruptures Nasi is talking about. And immediately some other scientists stand up at the end of the talk and they're just like, this is nonsense. Basically they're saying like, how dare you? And then, it's very tense for a moment. And then later throughout the day, throughout the course of the weekend, you have private conversations with this scientist who was really flipping out. And it turns out they're really just having this emotional reaction. and and then when you start to show them the little pieces, like, well, maybe this actually is a good idea. Eventually, they kind of calm down, but
But you walk away from them and they kind of revert back to this very stringent central perspective. And so I find that what we've been doing as part of this project is exploring people's psychology around changing their minds, about seeing things in a new light. And you seem to be somebody who's been so deeply focused on this that
Yeah.
I feel like there's rich ground here that maybe you haven't covered.
Well, I'd love to try to think about those things. You're reminding me of this one saying that's climbing the ladder, like this incremental part of science that you're talking about. So it's climbing the ladder of success only to realize it's up against the wrong wall.
Uh,
so true.
that's pretty good.
You really need to question the fundamentals, and when you don't do that, you're just buying into everything that went before. It also reminds me of Max Planck's famous statement about science proceeds funeral by funeral.
But what if it didn't have to be like that?
Yeah.
Well, exactly, exactly. And there's a whole bunch of interesting people that have done physics that you may want to interview if they're ready to it. That have talked to me about ideas that they've got under DMT
Hmm.
that later helped to develop very significant improvements in understanding warp drive, understanding theory of relativity. People that get these ideas under psychedelics. There's
That
a
one in
whole
particular is very geometric from what I understand. I've never experienced it myself, but everybody that we've talked to, it seems to have a particularly geometric nature to it, which might be conducive towards some of these more abstract ideas like in the relativistic and quantum worlds.
Mm.
Yeah. My first DMT experience, geometric is a good way to describe it, because at first I had this, and this is all within fractions of a second, but I had like a vertical line, then a horizontal line, then it turned into colors, it was red, then it turned into cubes, and then it turned into like an MC Escher staircase kind of thing that no longer made geometric sense, and then I was blasted into the universe, but it had this whole geometric flavor to it.
How well do you remember the experience?
Very well. I mean, I think that there are aspects of the psychedelic experience that are deeply imprinted on memory. I don't think we know exactly why, but for example, I did a 25-year follow-up to the 1962 Good Friday experiment that was done by Timothy Leary and Walter Pankey, and this was the first experiment to look at whether psychedelics contributed to a mystical experience. In this case, it was psilocybin in a religious setting in a Good Friday experiment. But
Oh, this was like in the basement of the church, and then
yeah,
all of the participants had this crazy mystical experience, and they like ran out of the church and like ran down the street, didn't they?
well, that's okay. Well, that happened to one person. So all of them didn't have the mystical, and that's what I discovered during the follow up. That it was the person that ran down the street um, didn't want to come back inside. And he had got the message. You have to tell people there's a man on the cross. You have to, I mean, this was an incredible minister, Howard Thurman, African American minister, phenomenal orator. And this guy said, I got to tell people there's a man on the cross. And he started running down. He left and he's thinking, oh, I got to tell the president. And then he thought, well, the president's in Washington. I'm in Boston. I'll tell the president of the university. And then Houston Smith and Walter Pankey went after him. And he didn't want to come back inside. And they gave him a shot of Thorazine and
Whoa.
to tranquilize him. And nobody, that was never mentioned at all. I only discovered that 25 years later during this follow-up study. But where I was going before was that, and we can talk about that more, but that one of the things that really distinguished the people who were in the placebo group and the people who were in the control group is how well they had vivid memories for certain parts of the experience. I think there's such a sort of emotional intensity that it gets deeply imprinted on memory, which is also why psychedelics can help you reformulate past memories, traumatic memories. You can, memory reconsolidation is a process that's talked about, how you can reconsolidate the memory, episodic memory and emotional memory, and you can substitute out the fear-based emotion with more of a calm emotion and also place the trauma in the past instead of always in the future.
It really
So,
argues for this theory that we're constantly creating our memories, right? That we sort of bring them up and make them either better or worse or change them somehow. But you look at people's actual ability to recall events as they are, and it's really bad actually. Like you're really convinced because the memory is real to you, but that's usually not how things happened.
yeah, and that also raises a whole kind of somewhat philosophical perspective about therapy. So let's say somebody says, I was abused when I was a 2-year old, and I remember this now, or my parents beat me up when I was 2, or something like that. Whether it, or I had a past life, and this was going on in my past life, whether it's true or not doesn't matter for the therapy. It's symbolically true, and you act as if it's true. Whether it's true um, based on what actually happened, let's say you were abused by somebody. There's a book that's come out called The Tell about a woman who, um, under the influence of MDMA therapy, has this was Oprah's book club of the month a couple months ago too. But it's how she recovers this memory of being abused in middle school. Um, and then she works through that from an emotional point of view and feels better. But then she wonders, should I take this into the criminal justice system? Is this true in that context? Should I let this abuser free to do this to other people or whatever? So then the second part of the book is kind of like a detective story trying to figure out if it was legally true or it true for a legal context. So I think the important distinction to make is that from a therapeutic perspective, you accept that the emotions are real, but whether the experience actually happened in the way that the memory isn't that important for the healing. But then if you want to take it out into the world and act on it in certain ways, then you have the second level of screen. But I think that our memories do change a lot over time. One of the things I really enjoyed about my dissertation, this was actually pretty much my favorite part, was to have to footnote everything that I thought was true. Every statement of fact that you make, you kind of have to find out, where did it come from? And it was amazing how much of what I thought was true was not true, or that I had misremembered it, or it was something wrong about it. And so that was really a joy in a way to fact check everything I thought.
We're
And
going through this exact same thing right this minute. We're in the process of finishing up our first book, and it's so funny that you mentioned that because that's what we've been completely consumed with all morning. Every morning is just going back through everything we've written and making sure that there's like not a single chronology that's in any way out of order. That the tiniest little details of the experiments that we're studying, because a lot of it was written in some sense off a bed of knowledge we'd accumulated over the past 10 years or something through conversations with different physicists and all of this. And yeah, we thought we had the stories completely dialed in, but it's really shocking how you don't actually. How the tiniest little, and that's the funny thing, is that when you write a dissertation or you write a book, especially in these science domains, you get one little thing out of place and everybody turns on you. It's like permission to stop listening to whatever you have to say, which is really, really interesting. The immune system is so strong. The defense system is so strong in the sciences, and I think this is why it's so difficult for scientists emotionally to move on from ideas that they became accustomed to for the same reason, right? It's such a well defended apparatus, which is good because it feels reliable that way, right? But at the same time, it can become a really emotionally treacherous landscape.
Well, it's really interesting. So we were whenever we do these recordings, we always have pre-shows with the people that we've invited. And so we get to talk to people for a little bit of time before the interview. And yesterday we were talking to this sci-fi author, RF antenna designer, and also a historian of physics.
Also worked under John Wheeler.
That's exactly where I was going to go. So he was
worked under who?
John Wheeler.
John Wheeler. Okay.
And so he, at some point, became enamored with this physics theory called pilot wave theory. And so pilot wave theory is a realist theory of quantum mechanics that says, look, you can have this wave-particle duality, and mathematically you can treat it as such, but we have to talk about what underpins these mathematical equations. There's something that's directing the outcome of an interaction, and it's these things that are called pilot waves. So it's like one step towards a materialistic interpretation of quantum physics. And so he discovers pilot wave theory. It was very, very popular right around the turn of the 20th century before it got completely replaced by this very immaterial field-based quantum mechanics. And so he goes to John Wheeler and he's like, hey, have you heard of pilot wave theory? And he's like, ah, yes, the screwdriver of physical theories. And he didn't really know what that meant. And so he left and he kind of tried to put it into his brain. And then he goes back to him and he's like, hey, have you written anywhere about your objections to pilot wave theory? Because he basically dismissed it out of hand as being just this idiotic, bauble. And Wheeler was like, I've never really taken the time to look at it. So no, I haven't.
He was like, put it on my list of things to do is to find something wrong with pilot wave theory.
Yeah. And so it strikes me that it's not just memory based off of experiences. It's also memories that we form because we've decided that this is a memory that we should have. Like he had this memory that he had a reaction to pilot wave theory that he had put into his mind as being the way that he should interact with the world. But then you kind of press a little bit and you're like, hey, is there grounds for that? And you discover that it's this very fragile edifice, but the fragility of it does not encourage any kind of transformation. And so I'm like, what is the basis by which people are resistant to transformation? So we treat psychedelics as being a tool for transformative experiences, but do we have insight onto the psychology of why transformation without them is so difficult?
Well, let me give you one example. Secondary gain is kind of this term for things that you get for having a disability in a way of some sort. So one of the veterans that was in our study, and I talked about this in my TED Talk, had terrible PTSD for years, disabled, couldn't work. And under the influence of the MDMA, in his first of 3 MDMA sessions, he realized that he was getting benefits from having PTSD. And the benefits were that was how he was showing his loyalty and honoring the memory of his friends who had died. As long as he was suffering, constantly suffering, this was in a way the memory of his friends who had died, and this was his way to keep them alive in a sense, to keep that. And then once he realized that, he was able to shift and see himself from the eyes of his friends who had died. And they were basically saying to him, we can't live. We don't want you to squander your life. We were killed. You're still alive. You can honor our memory by living. We can live through you. That's another way for you to honor our memory. And then he said to himself, okay, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And he said in that moment, he cured himself from PTSD. So I think some of the reasons that people are resistant to change is that they are getting these secondary gains, these secondary benefits from having these dysfunctional patterns because in some way it serves a need.
Well, suffering can feel very productive and virtuous in some ways, right? Especially if it's sacrificial in some way. I think that we don't have a very good culture left of sacrifice in the true sense. Like if you look at the history, ancient history, most people's were the idea of sacrifice was at the core of a lot of these cultures, right? And of course it plays out in what many people would now consider like barbaric rituals, putting animals on the altar and stuff. But I think that they're playing out some ability to celebrate this process of giving something of yourself. And I think in the absence of a unified culture of that, it plays out perhaps in these pathological ways where you sense that you should be giving, right? Whether it's to the memory of your ancestors, your friends who are fallen,
or to the physicists who came before you.
Yeah, there's another example that's actually very salient to me, only because it's a friend of mine, a very close friend, old lover from years ago, who is now, near the end of her 60s and has got really no family to support her and has constructed this kind of imaginary savior that's going to come, this guy on the white knight. And she's getting all sorts of messages. So it's psychosis for
Mm.
sure, but it cannot be invalidated. She'll say, "Oh, this guy, the stars are lining up. He's going to show up on this weekend." And then he never shows up. And then, well, maybe something was wrong. Maybe it's going to be next weekend or something like that. But the reason is underneath it, it meets a need. She's feeling fearful of aging without support and without money. And so this idea of this savior is something that's very calming to her, even though part of her is aware that it's crazy and her friends think she's crazy about it, but it meets another need. And well, one of the things that Adam Kinzinger said that strikes me, he was the Republican that was on the January 6th committee.
Mm.
And he said that he realized that there was something that people feared more than death, that he's come to realize that, and that's being kicked out of your tribe. So that's why the big lie, how is the big lie? For example, in this case, it's Trump won the 2020 election. How is it that people continue to believe that? Well, it's part of belonging. It's part of belonging to this group. And that's more important than rationality, more important than science, more important than logic, this belonging need. And that overwhelms so much. There's such a hunger for belonging that then there's no getting it. Look at all these doomsday cults that would also have this day the world's going to end. And you think when that day passes, they'll think, oh, this has been a delusion of mine. But then they say, no, 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 just it really the formula was wrong and it's going to be next month or something like that. It's because this need for many different things, belonging, meaning. Sometimes when you think you're on the edge of this transformation, it makes your life more exciting. So I think you need to look at um, what kind of emotional needs. Well, talking about scientists, so E.O. Wilson said something really good, which, well, many things, of course, but he said the real problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. So we are incapable as a human species of properly managing the technologies that we have because of our institutions and our primitive emotions. And so that's why we're in so much peril.
Okay, so the thing that you're describing, I think can be labeled as like a load-bearing belief. Would you agree with that?
I don't know quite what you mean by load bearing. I think I can get it, but if you could explain.
So a load-bearing belief is one that is a pillar of the mind, where it's a piece of information that you have to believe in order to complete your uh, functional picture of the world. And so I think that you can notice people's load-bearing beliefs by whether or not they get upset when you
Mm,
suggest that something
yeah,
might not work the way that they think it does.
yeah.
And so, like I remember somebody the other day was telling me that they they told their mom that milk was more hydrating than just drinking plain water. And the mom got really upset because she was like, "That's the dumbest thing that I've ever heard. How that's like what are you on?" But it's obviously true because it's an electrolytically complete substance. And so
Uh-huh,
she has some load-bearing belief about water versus milk, and so it caused her to be very, very upset.
uh-huh.
And so I think that for somebody who's noticed some kind of secondary gain from PTSD, the PTSD becomes a load-bearing belief about the world. I must feel this way
Yeah,
in order to perform the function that I need to function. I need to believe that some political event has happened the way that my community believes that it happened, because if I stop believing it, the entire world crumbles. And so it's like you can mess with people's load bearing beliefs and people can change their load bearing beliefs. But I think that it is a very catastrophic process of doing that because you are undermining the structural stability of somebody's entire worldview. And so the question then becomes, if we recognize that we have these Paleolithic load-bearing beliefs about the world, and that we have organized ourselves around these, tribal principles and archaic structures of pain and suffering and retribution, and that perhaps there's a different set of load-bearing beliefs that would make a better world, how do you actually induce that transformation to even begin in a way that doesn't destroy people?
Yeah, and I would say that I see one of the core issues that we need to face as a species is fundamentalism, particularly
Mm.
just fundamentalism. And how do we help people see that? And again, I'm coming from a more universalist perspective, but this idea um, that when you let go of the literalism, that there's something deeper underneath it, that you're not left with nothing. So much of religion is fundamentalist views. I mean, all the religions have their fundamentalist wings, and they take things really, really literally. And then they're saying everybody else that doesn't believe that what they believe is a danger to them. And it's a danger in part because they're not, part of them doesn't really believe what they believe, in the sense that they have some questions about it. And if somebody else asks questions, that makes them more unstable. And so then let me torture and kill you like this Spanish Inquisition, or let me make sure everybody claims that they believe this exact thing. So how do we help people get rid of these load-bearing beliefs, or to look at them more closely and see that there may be something else propping up underneath that that's even stronger? And I'll just relate this one point to me, which was, this was maybe 40 years ago, so it was a long time ago, but I was at Esalen, and I remember this very vividly, that I was, Esalen is on the cliffs of Big Sur overlooking the ocean. So I was on the fence overlooking the cliff. And I was just thinking, what happens if I don't focus my life around psychedelics? My life is focused on psychedelics. This is what I'm working on. What happens just if that wasn't my sort of core load bearing belief? And I felt this sort of swirl of fear and anxiety, like pulling me over the cliff almost. Like it would be this disastrous, terrifying thing to have to rethink my whole life, you know, in a different way and structured in a different way. Now, I don't think it's irrational necessarily to have focused my life on psychedelics, but that sense of fear of, here's how I organize myself, and what if I throw that out, and just who would I become? And I felt that I would lose myself. It was a very frightening experience.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of fundamentalism in physics as well, honestly. I know you're not a physicist, but it's such an interesting parallel that plays out in these intellectual spaces. And I feel like in your case, and in the case of reconsidering your fundamentals, and the same in science, a huge part of the solution set has to be having something to jump ship to, right? So there's these fundamental load-bearing beliefs, like space-time is fundamental, like the quantum world fundamentally doesn't make sense in this causative way that we're used to. And people inherit these ideas, and they become load-bearing because the alternative hasn't really risen to the surface in the minds of these people.
Well, yeah, because it's like, okay, so I'm imagining you on the cliffs of, it's Esalen? I've always
Yeah,
said it.
excellent.
Okay, never,
In
never,
Big
never
Beach.
been, only read, so I have it in my mind as Esalen. Okay, Esalen.
Excellent.
So you're standing over the ocean. You're having this moment where you're thinking of, like, what if I don't do psychedelics? And some of the fear and uncertainty about that must come from the fact that you're not saying, well, what if I don't do psychedelics? What if I do this instead? Right? Because is there like some void in front of you
Well,
that
that was the
you're
void. Yeah, I had nothing else. It wasn't, oh, this instead. It's just complete, like, everything's up in the air now. And just the anxiety about that. It wasn't, I was just thinking, if I throw this away, if this is how I organize my life, I think part of the fear was that there wasn't anything there. It wasn't like, oh, now I'll, go to become a stockbroker or whatever. You
what a
know?
parallel universe.
Yeah, there was just nothing there. It was like, But I think, one of the things that I've tried to
Oh,
model.
actually, hold on one second. Why were you thinking about it then? If there wasn't anything that was on offer
I
as an
was just
alternative.
wondering, who am I and how am I structured? And I was just thinking, hey, what if I throw out this fundamental plank of my whole life?
Do you think if somebody would have been there to ask you, like prompt you the right questions or something, that it would have led you into some possibility space that could have been productive? Or is there a solution to that gaping chasm?
Well, it would be what has meaning, what has purpose, what can deal with the world that I see is on a self-destructive path in so many ways, or at least a very dynamic path that's dangerous. So I don't know that anybody else there could have helped me come up with a new sort of fundamental principle on which I wanted to work on. I mean, I'd already had at that stage the pivotal dream of my life was a Holocaust survivor who, had survived miraculously, in his view, miraculously, but randomly probably, but just had survived and knew he would survive for a reason and wasn't sure what it was. And in the dream, he's telling me the reason I've survived now, I figured it out, is to tell you to study psychedelics and to
Well,
bring psychedelics back. Because with psychedelics, you can go beyond your sense of ego and merge with something bigger. And if we all realize that we're part of something larger than ourselves, then it's harder to dehumanize certain people. We're all, you know, part of some much collective, and and I thought once we realize that, then we can appreciate differences. And so I'd already had this kind of layers upon layers and upon layers to make this sort of my fundamental core mission. Um, but it was kind of a freeing thought to say, if I this is at my core who I am, and let me just throw that out and see for a moment. But it was scary. It was very scary, and I didn't really explore other options. I just got this fear, like, well, who ought I be? Then I'd have to build myself up from the ground again, and maybe in some new direction. But I think it was helpful, and I think one of the things I've tried to help our kids is with this idea that it's anxiety provoking, particularly after you get out of college or something. It's anxiety provoking. What are you going to do with your life? Or who do you fall in love with? Or who do you? And I said, it's the longer you can stay in these periods of indecision and uncertainty, the better off you are. That people choose things just to run away from the anxiety of not knowing,
hmm.
even if it's not necessarily the right person or the right career path. It's just, oh, this anxiety is what's motivating me to resolve it in any way that I can. And I think that's where we have a lot of religious fundamentalism. What's the purpose of life? What happens after I'm dead? What are my values? And people grow up believing certain things that give them an anchor to their life. I guess for me, Francis Collins maybe is a good example, who's sort of claims to be kind of a fundamentalist Christian who, he was the head of NIH. So he's both a scientist and he's saying, oh, yeah, Jesus is this sent from God somewhere and he's different than all other humans. And I'm like, how do you believe those things? And yet part of the Human Genome Project. So it's confusing. People can be very open minded in certain ways. And I don't mean to be, I mean, obviously I'm Jewish and I, didn't grow up thinking, you know, virgin birth and all this kind of stuff. And, but I think people.
There's a certain literalism to some interpretations of biblical stories that I think is always perplexing.
Yeah.
Right, where it's like it's perhaps there was a historical character, but it's like to
You're kind of
take
missing the point, though. It's
yeah.
kind of sad. It's kind of the same way everywhere, though, with all fundamentalism, right? Like, yeah, like space time is a usable abstraction, but at the same time, like it's an idea. Like you shouldn't treat it like a physical substance. Like you shouldn't treat these stories of these beautiful mythological stories from the Bible. You're gonna miss the substratum of all of the actions that you can embody as a result of it if you fixate on the pieces of the puzzle which are not important.
Oh, I just had this crazy idea. Like, what if actually those two belief systems of, on one level, being head of the NIH and on the other hand, being a biblical literalist are actually manifestations of the same sort of like almost reductionist approach to some body of knowledge, right? Because it's like I'm a biologist by training. I went into it thinking that I would understand something about life.
Yeah.
And the problem with biology is that you do not even begin to approach the topic of life in any way, shape, or form. You perform experiments on biological systems, but the question of what is life, what creates an animating force, what is death, like why does a body with all of its same molecules suddenly stop one day? Like none of these questions feature in biology whatsoever. And so maybe there is some kind of literalism there that comes from being so deeply steeped in this very biochemical paradigm for biology that actually correlates nicely to a literalist view of the Bible. I don't know.
Yeah, it
I
seems
might be mischaracterizing his views too. But I do have
This is Callis' demands
the,
audience.
the sense that he is more of a believing Christian, which I guess means that Jesus is different than everybody else.
well, it's a hell of a role model. Like I don't know
Yeah,
why people don't just leave it at that. It's so interesting.
maybe I should just share something that my wife worked for the World Council of Churches, which is like the Protestant Vatican. So but it's much more progressive, liberal, and she did a
They
lot.
have less gold.
They have less gold, yes, if that's what you meant. Yeah, and they're really more about helping the poor people, but they've reinterpreted some of the biblical miracle stories. And the one that stuck with me was the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes. So, Jesus has done the Sermon on the Mount, and there's all this kind of thing. And then there's this not enough food to feed all these people. And so he magically multiplies loaves and the fishes to feed everybody. And so when you think about it in that way, it's a mind over matter somehow or other, that you can create things out of nothing. It's something that is very difficult for people to do, but you need some godlike person or in a way that can do this. But the way they've reinterpreted that is that the real miracle was that Jesus was able to help people see they're part of this collective. We all need each other, and they were able to overcome selfishness. And so they all had enough food, but they were hoarding it, and then they give it to everybody, and there's enough for everybody in that way. So what that means is that story is a call to action for every individual. I need to be less selfish. When you turn it into it's a magic story, now you've got I don't have to do that. And the church is now sort of the power between you and this magical power. So it supports the institution, and it's a story that's hard to believe. That's where you need this quote faith and all of that. But the real challenge is for each of us is to overcome our own selfishness. So I think a lot of my guess is that a lot of these biblical stories that are miracle stories are made up in order to reinforce the power of the institution, the religious institution.
Which goes back to what you were talking about with belonging earlier, right? I think people have two choices when it comes to belonging. They can either like when they're faced with pieces of the puzzle that don't make sense, they either defend the ideology by advancing it and adapting it to the new circumstances, or they go this other road and try to undermine the new piece of information that comes into the landscape. And that could be relying on literalism. It could be defaming the person who's bringing you this information. It could be lots of different ways. And you talked about in this psychedelic experience feeling part of something larger.
Yeah.
And I've heard from other people too, especially in the DMT space, that you can feel part of something larger, but there are certain things that are larger which are not good too. Like there are two forces at play in the universe. To really simplify things.
Andres Gomez Emilson talks about this. He talks about like team replicator versus team consciousness, where when you have a DMT experience, there's two sorts of patterns that emerge. And there's a kind of pattern that's perfectly happy to manifest itself and to be vibrant and be surrounded by other interesting patterns. And then there's another kind of pattern that the moment that you notice it, it's sticky. And so then it travels across your field of vision and it gradually takes everything over and tries to turn everything into more of itself. And so he calls this kind of vibrant ecosystem of patterns team consciousness. And then the pattern that's sticky, that wants to make everything into itself, he calls it team replicator. Is this what you're referencing?
Yeah, and I think the appeal to magic and literalism is an attempt to sort of short circuit people's brains and get them to replicate with you, as opposed to actually advancing the sort of tapestry of the mythological narrative or the science or whatever it is, really, because these are fundamentally useful things. Like, we love science, we love mythology. Like, they've stuck around. For mythology in particular has been around with us forever because these were useful stories and useful ways to convey wisdom across time intergenerationally. Like, these are important pieces of the human project.
Yeah, I think this the distinction is interesting. My first DMT experience was, as I described it initially, this geometric, and then I was blasted into this, universe that didn't make geometric sense anymore. And then I had this long period of going through human evolution or life evolution and all this, and it's this beautiful, glorious thing, and I'm part of everything, and it's billions of years to get me here, and all of this. But then I had the thought, and I don't exactly know where this thought came from, but the thought was that if I'm part of everything and everything is part of me, then Hitler is a part of me. It's not out there. The evil is not just out there. I'm this good thing and I'm part of all this evolution. And then there's this bad thing out there. But you can't claim part of everything and then only want the good parts of it. That all of it is within our potential and within our history. So that for me was this shattering kind of a thought. And that's what I valued, logic, I guess I could say, because I've relied in my life on these kind of logical thoughts that sometimes feel more relevant than my emotions. Like, oh, I want to be part of everything and I want to be great and good. But oh no, now Hitler's part of you. You have to own up to those tendencies. And so I really valued. Another way to say this is in terms of jealousy, in terms of emotions. I've been sort of um, carried through certain moments of jealousy by thinking, oh, this logic. If someone really wants to fall in love with somebody else, that's better for her, better for them, and I'll be more appropriate. I'll find somebody more appropriate for me. But the jealousy is this emotional raging storm. But the logic is what's helped me sort of weather the emotional storms. So that's where to get back to science. You would think that scientists would value this logical flow more so than these emotional storms that they need to belong or they need to believe this. And I'll just add that I've had this kind of questioning of my fundamental assumptions lately because, I mean, I grew up during the 60s and the hippies are using psychedelics and they're anti-Vietnam War movement, and it's about Earth and the environmental movement and the women's movement and all of this. So I kind of identified psychedelics with being progressive, that breaking down the ego structures and stuff. And now the irony for me to have to deal with is that we have a lot of really core supporters that are in the Trump administration. How is that possible? I mean, it's an administration based on hate, based on demonizing others, based on um, power for its own sake. And my whole thought was that psychedelics will be an antidote to that. And now I'm really
There are also people who've been institutionally alienated too. I think that might be the population at the core there.
yeah. So it's for me, I guess. I still think on average, maybe the more psychedelic experiences people have, the more they process varied emotions, the more they see our interconnections that will contribute to an evolution of the species in a good way. But that there seems to be a lot of notable exceptions.
Uh, Can I touch on you mentioned logic really quickly. I just want to touch on this because logic's a funny little thing.
Hmm.
Because I also identify, and I think probably most humans do at their core, as wanting logical explanations and logical understandings, right? Because then you can actually, from an engineering perspective, retool your circumstances or environments or make better predictions about the future. So it makes sense we want to be logical. The funny thing about logic, though, and especially this is no more clear than in mathematics, is that it's all about the assumptions that underpin your logic at the end of the day. So you can process a completely insane assumption logically and arrive at equally insane conclusions as a result of it. And we're not really taught in the scientific tradition, especially in the mathematical science tradition, to really examine, in the case of where we come from with physics, the physical assumptions that are at the core of the logic, which is processed. We exclusively fixate in publication, in dialogue, on following the story from its starting point without talking about the starting point. And I think that's maybe at the heart of the failure for us to satisfy a really rational picture of reality, in spite of being very logical people. People in these fundamentalist churches can be very logical, but
Yes.
it's like, what's your assumption at the core of that?
So this makes me think of the fact that assumptions are also kind of your starting metaphysics.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so in the 1960s, if you had exclusively people with leftist metaphysics that were playing with psychedelics, then we construct a model of psychedelics as being something that is somehow related to this radical openness and acceptance and low neuroticism or whatever.
Love.
Yeah, exactly. That you can place onto it. And so I think that what Shiloh's pointing to, which I think is really relevant, is that we don't have a ton of information about what happens when people with a different set of starting assumptions about what the world looks like and how it operates begin to also use these substances.
Yeah, I think that's very, very right. I think one of the ways that that's brought to mind for me is one of the ayahuasca churches from Brazil,
Hmm.
the União de Vegetal. So they were the ones that was the first ayahuasca church that really went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court and won the case that they could legally use ayahuasca in the United States. They tend to be the more conservative of the ayahuasca churches. They're a little bit more um, the wealthier people. They're not so much from the jungle so much as in the major cities. But some of the leaders ended up supporting Bolsonaro,
Hmm.
who was destroying the Amazon, and it caused a big split in the church. So, how is it that a church whose sacrament is a plant, a series of plants from the Amazon, gets so wrapped up into power and institutional development that they will support somebody that's destroying the Amazon? So, what that suggests to me is that sort of what you were just saying, the cultural context is more important than the experience. We interpret the experience in the context of the cultural perspective. You could say it's our operating assumptions or something. That those are the bigger framework. And this sort of leads me to one of the biggest mistakes of the drug war and of prohibition is that we've made it so certain things have certain powers. This is a bad drug. This is a good drug. This is an addictive drug. And what we lose track of, it's the relationship that you have with the drug that determines whether it's beneficial or harmful. So we go from relationship kind of thinking into simplistic, more the thing itself.
Mm.
And so I think that's where this idea for me, I think I did have this idea. Why did Nixon say Timothy Leary is the most dangerous man in America? Because of these ideas connected to psychedelics that can change your perspectives, that then make you more interested in civil rights, more interested in um, peace rather than war, more interested in challenging energy systems. But I think that that was kind of overly limited by that sense that in that cultural context, that's how I saw this. And now I'm seeing that you can have different cultural contexts that interpret the psychedelic experience in different ways that don't necessarily produce these kind of progressive thinking.
What do
So
you
it's like a
think?
kind of institutionalized, legalized version of culture I mean, at least using the same root of the word is religion, like cults essentially, but like legal cults. So religion, right?
Yeah.
And I really wanted to talk to you a little bit, if it's okay, if we move in that direction uh, about the medicalization versus the religious
Ah,
attempts at this, because
yeah.
from where I'm sitting, it seems like the religions have had a better go at it than the medical approach to the implementation of these. And I wonder if that isn't just more fruitful from the stance of it seems to be a spiritual transformation fundamentally, and that the attempts to medicalize spiritual problems, whether it's through therapy or, these weird antidepressive attempts and the anxiety medications that screw people over even worse than they were before. And like, I wonder if the medical approach isn't insufficient. And I know you've been working a lot through that route. So,
Yeah.
I don't want you to
Good.
take. I
Yeah.
have a lot of respect for the work you've done so far, but I'm curious if you think that there's a more promising route possible.
I think that
Why
they're
not
all.
a cult?
I mean,
Is
how about lots of cults that don't
that-
turn into the creepy kind of Manson types that we
Yeah.
are
Well, I
afraid of?
think there's a kind of ritual of medicine as well. So to think that this is medical and it's not ritualized in certain ways is not right. But one of the well, first off, looking back in history, religion and medicine were wrapped up together. You would be praying for medical healings, or you would be, um, there was kind of this lack of differentiation in a way between, these spiritual experiences and also these kind of healings that you were hoping to get. And so I'm going to Brazil in a couple weeks, and one of the people I'm going to meet with is a scientist, a neuroscientist who grew up in Brazil, has had very powerful experiences with ayahuasca in the jungle, but then decided to bring ayahuasca into the clinic, into a hospital setting without ritual for the treatment of depression. So, by without ritual, I mean without like a religious service or all that. There would just be here, drink this cup, and but it was sort of like a medical therapeutic ritual. And what he found was that people got better
Hmm.
even in this medicalized setting with this sort of vine of the soul, which is sort of the interpretation of the word of ayahuasca. So I think that there's ways in which there's something holy and spiritual about medicine and about science in a way, if you're quote searching for truth and questioning your basic assumptions. So I don't think that there's such distinction between here's the religious, here's the medical. Then he switched this fellow to using smokable DMT instead of ayahuasca, and also for depression, and the results are as good as. So now it's not even it's the extract of the some of the plants, but it's not this mixture. Um,
It
and
seems like the appropriate comparison though might be against somebody who, or even the same individual who was accompanying this experience with something in the ceremonial or their, talk space, something like that, right? Like it might. I'm not totally surprised that it would be beneficial by itself, but would it be more beneficial with some cultural? Uh,
hmm,
I mean, maybe. So there's actually a really interesting thing that you mentioned in one of your other interviews about Bromo-LSD,
yes, yes, yes.
where there was a trial where I think it was at Hopkins.
No, it was here at McLean Hospital at Harvard. Yeah.
I see. Do you want to tell the story?
Yeah, yeah. So this is around 2003, 2004, and there's a group called Cluster Busters, and there are people with cluster headaches, which are worse than migraines, suicide headaches. It's really, it's like a brain freeze when you take something cold, and it can be very painful, but it can go on for long periods of time. So it's really horrible. And this group has a member that went ahead and had terrible cluster headaches, but then took some psilocybin and went to a festival, and then noticed that the cluster headaches didn't come in the normal time. And then they've developed this whole approach towards treating it once you have a cluster headache. It's once every 5 days you take for 3 times, you take psilocybin or LSD, and it breaks the cycle of the cluster headaches and then delays the cycle returning. So they contacted me and they said they didn't want to be criminals. Could we do some research? So we started. So I brought this to the researchers at McLean Hospital, and they wanted to look at this. But they said the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the medical records, and we're going to verify, do these people who claim this really have cluster headaches? Did they take notes when they took psilocybin or LSD? And how do we know that this really is related? So they did this kind of literature-based study and determined that it looked like it really worked, that this LSD and psilocybin really worked. And so then the next step was going to be to study people with cluster headaches and administer LSD or psilocybin. And the people at Harvard were like, "Oh no, the ghost of Timothy Leary is still flying around here. We're not. We will only do that study with LSD or psilocybin if it's the last resort. If there's nothing else, we'll do everything we can to avoid, actually giving LSD or psilocybin to somebody. Maybe we can figure out some other way to help these people with cluster headaches." So the researchers, Torsten Passy and John Halpern, came up with this idea that they would look at Bromo-LSD, which is a non-psychedelic version of LSD. It has this bromine molecule, and somehow it renders it doesn't dock in the same places in the brain, and it's not psychedelic. So the plan was that they would study Bromo-LSD, and then they would show it didn't work, and then we would be back to studying LSD or psilocybin, because we have no idea really why LSD or psilocybin works for cluster headaches. But the thought was, what is unique about these molecules? What's unique is they get you high in a psychedelic way. So we figured that the medical value somehow or other was linked to the psychedelic portion of the molecule. And you knock that out with the Bromo LSD, then it's not going to work. So that was the plan. And months and months go by, and nobody's telling me what's going on. I'm like, I keep asking, what's the results of the research? What's the results of the research? Finally, they said, we didn't want to tell you because the Bromo LSD actually works. And it works better than LSD or psilocybin. Because for whatever reason, LSD is in micrograms, psilocybin is milligrams, but Bromo LSD, which is not psychedelic, you can take it in much larger quantities. And so, when they told me about that, I was like, look, I'm about what's best for patients. It doesn't, and it's not psychedelic therapy anyway. But that was sort of one of the first signs of what's going on today in what is called neuroplastogens, or non-psychedelic psychedelics. There's a whole lot of research now being done into how do you get the neuroplasticity? How do you open up critical periods? How do you do it in a way where people don't have to go through the psychedelic experience, which some people see as kind of a negative side effect? Now, I think the psychedelic experience confers meaning, the storytelling, the memories, the emotions. And yet, for stroke, there's like, how do you recover function after a stroke? Well, maybe one of these neuroplastogens that doesn't have a psychedelic experience can be helpful for that. So I'm very supportive of this whole field of development, but I don't believe that it will replace the meaning and the rewriting of your own story and the emotional release, the emotional catharsis of psychedelics. But yeah, the Bromo LSD was the first example that I ever knew of a non-psychedelic psychedelic. This is more than 20 years ago, that actually had incredible therapeutic potential for a very limited thing.
Do they not feel anything? It seems like having a super plastic brain all of a sudden would feel different. But
Well, does it actually evoke plasticity, or?
We have no idea. I mean, again, it's unfortunately, for reasons that are not quite clear to me, no pharma company has taken this on to develop Bromo LSD. They have patents. There is Kerry Turnbull has invested around $10 million in preliminary research, but he's waiting for some. And it's a really dire situation. Actually, ironically, what just happened at their Psychedelic Science 2025 conference, that we had about 8,000 people to a couple weeks, a month and a few weeks ago,
Wow.
is that I met with the people from Clusterbusters.
Hmm.
And now what they've discovered is that you smoke DMT, this keeps getting back to DMT, and it seems to cut the cluster headaches in seconds. It seems to work even better, and it works in sub-psychedelic doses. So with
That's
these vape
so
pens.
wild.
Yeah, so the whole development
I'm
of
interested. I get
of
really bad migraines sometimes, so
oh,
I don't know if it
well,
works for migraines,
they
but
do
it's
think that it just might. So, yeah, and so there's development of all these vape pens, where now you have different doses of DMT you can have, or 5-MeO DMT in these vape pens. So it's like the underground is so far ahead of the actual clinical research.
Which is
But
kind
well,
of like it comes back to Shiloh's earlier point, where it's like there is a certain ethos that seems to lend itself more to these religious spaces that where people are trying things and they're focused on healing, and it's a spiritual practice coupled to this psychonaut like data driven approach
Mhm.
that is maybe distinct from the pure pharmacological isolation of a certain substance that can pass through FDA approval without raising the hackles of
Yeah.
everybody that thinks that psychedelics are a bad and dangerous
yeah,
thing.
I was gonna just say it's a pragmatic thing. Like if you mentioned the vape pens, the only place I know of where you could buy such a thing is actually a church in Oakland. I'm serious. I
No,
mean,
no, I know.
yeah, it's a funny
Yeah.
place too because the first time I went there, um, it was just a dispensary, like a normal cannabis dispensary, but a pretty run down and scary looking one, actually. Lots of big, scary dudes with guns, and like it basically felt like the back of a warehouse somewhere. But I went back there recently, and they've commissioned all this beautiful artwork there, very psychedelic, day glow artwork stuff. And they've actually done a pretty good job of kind of moving it in that more aesthetic, spiritual arm of things, but from a practical standpoint, it seems like they've had better success treating it as a religious tool than perhaps people in Congress treating it as a medicine.
Well, I think that that is a political statement. So the rise of the psychedelic churches, I started laughing when you said Oakland. I don't know if you mean the Church of Ambrosia.
It's called Zydor.
Yeah, that's it. That's the same one. Yeah, so that's Dave Hodges. So that's a friend of mine that started that. And they have 125,000 members. They distribute equal sell around 90 pounds of mushrooms every month. What keeps them sort of safe in some ways is that they don't mail order. You have to come to the church to get it. But this is sort of this paradoxical benefit of the rise of fundamentalism. So he started talking about fundamentalism at the beginning as kind of a danger. But the religious right has so much power that now they've won a bunch of legal cases. So if you want to discriminate against somebody's gay and you don't want to bake a cake for their wedding, you don't have to. Before you had to. So there's been so much legal authority given to churches to discriminate or do whatever they want that there's a fear by the police authorities and the DEA that if you go after these churches, you might actually create a bad precedent and they might win a religious freedom defense. So there are hundreds of psychedelic churches in the United States of all different kinds. And it's not even limited to plant medicines. There's MDMA churches, LSD churches. And so my personal view is that the drug war is counterproductive. It's violating fundamental human right to explore your consciousness, and that whatever ways people can have access to it are good. Is better than prohibition, let's just say. So the medical route, though, is the driver of social change. So the medical route gives you the key opinion leaders, gives you the credibility of science, gives you earned media that you don't have to pay for, gives you healing stories. And so once you have enough of these sort of scientific justifications or that sort of that leads into changing culture, and then culture opens up in different ways. So another example is medical marijuana leading to legalization of marijuana. That people think marijuana, some people were thinking it's only harmful, there's no benefits, it's all terrible. Before you know it, you're going to be addicted to heroin. One puff of marijuana, now you're addicted. But then when you show that under certain conditions, medical marijuana can be helpful for a whole range of different conditions, then people start thinking, well, maybe other stuff I've told is not true. Why should this be illegal? So I'd say the rise of the psychedelic churches is in large part due to the science and to the medicine and to the growing consensus that psychedelics have been unfairly demonized and that they've been portrayed only as hallucinations. It's fake, it's not real, and it's an escape. And you can be psychotic with one dose. I grew up believing that if you took LSD 6 times, you were clinically insane.
I remember that meme from when I was a kid. I do remember there was a distinct number of times before you would be labeled officially.
I remember it being in like 5th grade, and we had Dare. You remember Dare?
I do.
Oh my God! So we had Dare every week. It was actually really fun because you got to hang out with a cop, and he had like a gun, and it was kind of crazy. But I remember just hearing these stories, like them describing what these drugs were like, and just being terrified. Like it just sounded like the worst nightmare you'd ever had in your life. I'm like, why would anybody do that to themselves?
Yeah.
And
The
yeah, it's
problem is
impressions.
that once you have heard these exaggerated stories, if there starts to be this counter narrative that you hear about, then it causes you to question everything, and then you don't know what to believe.
The void.
It also turned out Dare actually increased drug use rather than decreased drug use, because the way that they initially did it was everybody's doing drugs. You're going to have all this pressure and you got to resist. Drug abuse resistance education is what Dare stands for. You got to resist all these pressures. And then people get the idea, oh, everybody's doing this. Well, why? Maybe I should be doing it too. So it had this.
I remember by the time we were in high school, it was actually like cool for the potheads that all wear the Dare t-shirts,
Yeah.
Like it totally folded back on itself in the span by the time people had even gotten out of middle school or whatever it was, elementary school.
I have this vision of a world where there's just churches where you can go to fix what's wrong with you. Like a church where you can heal attachment issues, a church where you can go and heal your cluster headaches, a church where you can go and fix your marriage. And at some point,
sounds like ancient Greece to me.
I know, I'm like, this is such a pagan worldview, but at the same point, wouldn't a culture where there were abundant places of healing that weren't just through the medical system be a much richer and more integrated culture? Because there's something about the medical system that is so
cold,
and sterile. Like I checked out one of the psychedelic treatment centers down in Ashland, Oregon, and so psychedelics are legalized in Oregon, but the problem is that almost every single rural community set up a referendum where they voted to prohibit the construction of psychedelic treatment centers in rural areas. And so ideally, you'd want to go to a place that's very beautiful and serene and have the ability to commune with nature in some way. But the reality of the industry is that they're in converted office parks with, fluorescent lighting and little Buddhist iconography and maybe like a big plushy pillow that you can lie on in order to have this experience. And
big plastic trees.
Like one of the rooms was the cheapest room was completely this windowless interior room with that like office drop ceiling, and it was a harrowing experience because I was writing a piece on them for the local paper, and so they took me around and they showed me all the spaces, and I was like, it seems like a horrible place to have this experience, and yet this is the attractor that having to push it through a therapeutic space where it's psychiatry and psychology and the doctor's office and the person in the chair with the notepad who's like taking notes on you while you go. I'm like, this seems weird. It seems like it's not the place that we want to push this necessarily.
It's also only open to people who have $3,000 to drop on a weekend, which is not the people who live around here,
Yes.
Yeah, well, the other part of it is that 10,000 plus people have received psilocybin in Oregon. And the beauty of the Oregon situation, aside from the facilities that you're talking about, is that you don't need to have a diagnosis. You can do it for personal growth. So already it's one step better than the medicalization, where you have to have a diagnosis to treat. So the other part is that 10,000 people have received psilocybin, which is more than all the people who've received psilocybin in clinical trials for the last 25 years. So these state level reforms are really about providing access. Now, you're talking about $3,000. It's not covered by insurance. That's one of the disadvantages. But we have so many people in America that don't have insurance now because of the big, horrible bill that was just passed. There's going to be millions more that are not going to have insurance. And these are often people that are the most stressed. And the pharma companies are going to be charging thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars per a single dose of psilocybin or a dose of MDMA. So the kind of state level reforms, you can grow mushrooms. You don't need to necessarily get psilocybin. So even though you're paying thousands of dollars for the therapy time and things like that, one of the things that needs to be developed is group therapy. That'll help reduce some of the cost per person. Um, so there's advantages for all these different ones. I think we need all these options. But you talked about ancient Greece. So I just want to talk about the Eleusinian mysteries for a moment.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so that was from 1600 BC to 396 AD. So it's the longest running mystery ceremony in the history of the world that we're aware of. And it was based on a potion called Kykeon that you drank at a certain point in this walk to Eleusis. More or less, it takes the time from when you drink it to the time that you get to this Eleusis. It's more or less the time that it takes an LSD-like drug to be at its peak, like 3.5 hours, something like that. And that was to be at least one per time in your life, people were encouraged to do that. And this was in a religious context, but it was to teach you the mystery of life and death and of eternal life and how we're part of something bigger. And it was so democratic in a way that they said even women and slaves could participate, not just the guys.
Wow.
Hmm.
So it was really forward looking. Slaves even. And so it was this story that had emotional impact. You could not say what happened under pain of death. So we don't know exactly what the ceremonies were like. The people that made the documentary, The Social Network, which was the most popular documentary, are making a documentary about a book, The Immortality Key, about early Christianity and the Eleusinian mysteries, and how in the first couple of hundred years, when Christianity overlapped with the Eleusinian mysteries, there's good evidence to suggest that some of the communion wine was spiked with psychedelic substances.
Hmm.
But in 396, it was wiped out by the Catholic Church. Again, because when you can have a direct experience of spirituality, maybe you don't need the church so much. Maybe they're not your powerful intermediary. So the church took it upon themselves to wipe it out. And that's really the last time in Western culture that psychedelics have been fully mainstreamed. You know, we go through the burning of the witches during the Middle Ages, and these are often women that knew plant healings, but also knew psychedelic plants. The conquistadors, first people they tried to kill was the shamans that did the work with peyote or the work with mushrooms or the work with ayahuasca, because they were often the center of the community. So when we think about mainstreaming psychedelics, either in medicine or religion or in any kind of context post approval, like where you can hopefully, buy substances on your own without it being part of religion or medicine, that's what real freedom would be, is that all of these are efforts that are really going after a millennium and a half of repression or so. So it's really quite not surprising, you could say, that we would have this blip during the 60s of psychedelics seemingly emerging, and then there would be this massive backlash. And then it took a half a century for us to sort of adjust as a culture, and now to start moving forward. And how well we'll do this, even, one of the few things that's not part of the culture wars is psychedelics.
Hmm.
I mean, it's absolutely shocking. And that's in large part because of the work with veterans. And that's where we've got bipartisan support as a conscious strategy to try to have sympathetic patients. But I would say that the Eleusinian mysteries were again this kind of spiritual but also emotional experience that could take away the fear of death. It could take away a certain sense of meaninglessness. was really powerful, and that is the origins of democracy in the Greeks, the origins of philosophy in a lot of ways, certain kind of sciences, and so I think we're in a multi-thousand-year process of um, really trying to become balanced. And you could say also that you have a lot of mythology with religions too. So that's when you talk about sort of plank beliefs, fundamental beliefs. A lot of them are freighted with these mythological stories that you're not supposed to question. So now we've developed a rational mind in such a way, but really the emotional, irrational part is way underdeveloped. And so that's what I see as the challenge of the age right now that we're in, is how do we bring back the evolution of our emotional and spiritual development to match responsibly handling the technologies that we have developed. And so I think the medicalization is one route, the religious churches are another route, the drug policy reform is another route. And the biggest thing is this sort of coming out. So we look at gay rights and gay marriage, and what happened there a lot is that people who had been hiding the fact that they were gay couldn't really speak. They were too scared. And then you get people speaking out, and you say, hey, you're a football player, and how can you be gay? You're the classic masculine. How could you possibly be gay? Or you're a scientist, or you're a musician, or whatever you are. Once they came out, then you see, hey, they're just like me. They just happen to have this different orientation. And so I think that's what we need with psychedelics, of all sorts of people coming out in a way to say, I was interested in that. And I think in particular, we should get back to scientists. So this person who had this encounter with the DMT entities that told him about quantum physics and about warp drive and about um, different kind of things, is scared to say where his inspiration come from, because people will then discount it. And I'm like, well, look, it's about the outcomes, right? If they like your math, what does it matter if some DMT entity told you? But I think there's a lot more of this going on in science than we realize. Who was it that had the dream of the benzene ring? It was one of the early big scientific discoveries, but it came to somebody in a dream.
I think it was Kekule. Is that possible?
I'm not sure, but it was. But yeah, I think
Was
it's
it like Carrie Mullis and PCR too? Those kind of
well,
things. There's a
Carrie
number of
Mullis.
these. Yeah.
I got to know Carrie Mullis a little bit. He actually gave us one of the best quotes that we ever had at MAPS, this was after he won the Nobel Prize. And then his quote was, I might have been stupid in some respects if it weren't for my psychedelic experiences. It was really pretty amazing. I think it was the Ouroboros or something, the snake eating its tail, and then that became somehow the benzene ring.
Yeah,
And
it was Kekule who had the dream of the Ouroboros.
Okay, yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. So I think a lot of scientific ideas maybe come from this inspirational space that maybe is when you question these fundamental beliefs, so you can stay in this unknowing space, and then you kind of maybe come up with some new thinking that you haven't.
Being comfortable with the unknowing, that's a really interesting piece of this puzzle. Hey guys, quick interruption to remind you that this podcast is paid for entirely by you guys, which means we work directly for you, but we need you to help us pay the bills. So I'd like to ask you to come over and check out patreon.com/DemystifySci, where you can get involved for as little as 75 cents a week. And if you do join up, then you can come and talk to us every week and tell us your thoughts, tell us how we can do a better job. But the bottom line is that we don't have to cave in to any sponsors or anybody other than the curiosity that we all hopefully share in this endeavor. So I'm going to need your help over at patreon.com/DemystifySci.
I just started reading Jung's Red Book.
Ah, my goodness, great.
And so I accidentally stumbled into this audiobook version of it that actually has hours of preamble. The person who translated the work or assembled it for publication is going through all of the chapters in Jung's life as he's getting to the point where he's writing the Liber Novus. And it turns out that Jung started having these crazy prophetic visions of death and destruction and, rivers of blood and piles of bodies. And he thought that he was having a psychotic break. And then the war started. And then he was like, oh my God, I was having precognitive visions of something that was building and fomenting around me. And as soon as the war started, the visions ended. And there's all these letters that the guy has in the introduction where Jung's talking about the fact that, number one, for anybody else, this would have been a full schizophrenic break because the bandwidth of the experiences would just be so overwhelming that it would completely erase them. And he's like, I have enough experience with this and I have enough training that I was able to step outside of it and to have this process of shaving away the sharp edges so that they didn't rip me apart. I'm paraphrasing. But then he's also freaking out because he's like, I can't tell anyone about this. They're going to think I'm crazy. I'm 100% certain that I had these experiences for a reason, that they were very, very real. I have notebooks filled with my dreams. I have all of this data, but there's no way that I can present it to the world because they will literally excommunicate me from the sciences. And he has this woman who's transcribing the book and is also getting therapy from him. And she's convincing him that he should package it as both a work of art and science so that the truth is hidden somewhere in it, but it's not clear where the truth necessarily is and the fiction begins. And so he's making all of these crazy paintings and assembling them into this massive book. And so it just strikes me that this process by which you discover knowledge by some way that you're not supposed to have the knowledge, and then you're stuck with the conflict of, well, okay, how do I present it to people in a way that they're actually going to listen, is not a new problem just for psychedelics. It's something that just continuously comes up in the history of humankind, I think.
Well, the Red Book, actually, Jung didn't want it to come out when he was alive.
Yeah, he was terrified.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's astonishing. I think, I guess I don't believe in foretelling the future. I would say in a more quantum way, I would say like these are probabilities
Mm.
rather than fixed things. So I don't know how Jung actually saw it, but I think that he could see the trends. He talked about archetypes, how countries are sort of captured by these warlike archetypes. And we see the kind of hatred that's developing in America about immigrants and all of this, us and them. So you see these kind of um, beyond
Spirits.
individual, yeah, kind of I don't know, spirits, but just the kind of certain kind of energies that get released, and that
Yeah,
they
and I
take
think that
over.
he was tuned to it, right? Because it's hard to imagine living through it's hard to imagine a conflict as massive as World War One not having plenty of preceding. Was it, do you remember
That
what
was
year?
World War
It
II.
was World War Two. Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
but still, it's like it's impossible to imagine World War
Yeah.
Two starting without there being plenty of uh
I believe he called it a
noise about it
collective
in the air.
consciousness or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah, where
just
he was
just
just
as like a feeling.
yeah, he channeled the events that were starting to already appear, and it's like you're reading the newspapers, you're thinking about dreams, you're thinking about mythology, you're thinking about the way that these things unroll, and perhaps there's really only one conclusion. And if war hadn't started, perhaps then he would have just been like, oh, well, maybe it was just some weird collection of thoughts, but maybe there is a critical juncture at which point it seems inevitable that this is how it goes.
Or maybe if he would have, with whatever credibility he had, would have let people know about it, that this is the direction my fears are, that we're going in this direction, maybe, people would have taken other actions. Actually, there was a great editorial yesterday in the New York Times, and it was about how Trump is not the problem, it's the elite capture that's the problem.
Interesting. Say more
And not
about
so
that.
much elite capture, but it's the elite surrender in a way. You get the law firms that surrender, the Columbia universities. You get so Trump has got these terrible authoritarian instincts, but he's captured Congress. He's captured it's the people that are giving away their power that's the real problem.
Well, I think that people are also
The same thing happened with the previous administration too. Right? There's all sorts of crazy capture of different institutional structures.
that's definitely the case. But I also think that what we're seeing right now is that in some ways there's this feeling that nothing really ever happens. And I think that people also want to, I get the feeling that people want a fire to burn so that there's motivation to be able to change things. And then there's this aftermath of rebuilding and regeneration. Like if you take there to be an ecological parallel between the way that, say, the forests in the Pacific Northwest operate and the way that human society grows. Like there's a point where it gets to be so overgrown and so poorly managed and so devastatingly disorganized that the only thing that can happen is that you have a wildfire. And you're stuck with this problem. Like we live in the woods right now and we're looking around and it's a tinderbox. Every single year the problem gets worse. Nobody has any idea what they're going to do to fix it. And so I think that maybe what we're seeing is we're just seeing that everybody's walking around with this seed of like, man, things are really bad right now, and nobody really knows what to do about it. And so they're reflecting on the past and they're like, well, that didn't work out really either. And now the pendulum swings, and at least it's something to organize around in order to galvanize whatever future will emerge from it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. I think that people want change, and a lot of times they're happy with just burn it all down, which is not the most efficient way to do it. It's and I think we do know a lot of what's going on. It's captured by the elite. We have more income inequality. People don't know how to. Most people, just imagine how. I guess I don't know the exact number, but half the American population or something can't handle a $500 unexpected expense. So you're living on this edge of anxiety all the time, and yet you've got people that have, $250 billion or whatever. So we've got capitalism has evolved to the point where well, what we just saw with this bill, it's the biggest transfer of wealth from poor people to wealthy people that has ever happened in the American history.
Is that inflation adjusted?
I believe so because, well, I can't say for a fact, but I think it is because I don't think we've had such inequality
Mm.
as we do now, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And so I think for many people, they're struggling.
Well, so
And
it's interesting that you say that you can't predict the future because I think that at some level, I'm not a determinist. I think that there's a lot of physical theories that people will put together that lead them to believe that there's absolutely no free will and that everything is predetermined and the probabilistic
Well, that's
out.
the promise of science, is the ability to predict the future, ultimately.
But I think that there are moments where the situation gets to be so far from equilibrium that you can't, as you approach the moment of rupture, you can start to predict the future. And this is kind of the myth of Cassandra, right? Is that somebody stands there and is like, well, you guys know that this is how it's going to go, right? And nobody listens. And then it happens that way. And it's like, well, is that truly prophecy, or is it just being able to have a sufficient vision of the way that things fit together that you're like, look, enough of these things have happened that we're down a bad path. And it seems like all of the
I,
trauma responses are in full bore.
I love that you use the word vision. I
Mm.
do think that vision is something we don't nurture as much as we should for kids and for young scientists and people coming up to inhabit all of these the tech world, sorry, in
Oh,
general is a great
yeah.
example of this, where you have all these brilliant minds who are like working like feverish bees towards what though? Like, what are we doing, guys?
We
We're
had this crazy experience. So we have a friend who started a company in San Francisco to produce in like 3D printers for semiconductor chips.
Hmm.
So basically, right now, in order to make a microchip, you have to design it, then you have to send it to some fab like TSMC. They have to print it for you, they have to ship it back. 6 to 9 month lead times from the moment that you design the microchip to the moment that you can actually test it inside of your device. And they're like, no, we want to build something that is the size of a tabletop, that's $50,000, that every single company can have in-house, that they can just make them and prototype them within like a couple hour window. Okay, great. The kid who is the brains behind this, his name is Sam Zaloof, and he, when he was, I think, 17 or 18, used hardware store components to build a semiconductor fab in his parents' garage. And now he's the head of this company. And so we went on a tour of Atomic Semi and we were talking to him. And he's telling me this story about the arc of what they're going to make, which is, okay, so first we make these machines that can print the semiconductors. And then we have machines that are able to repair themselves and upgrade themselves. And so we're creating this kind of parallel form that's going to be imbued with intelligence and is able to think about the world and make more of itself. And it's crazy. It's wild. And I'm like, well, do you have any organizing myths for how you're doing this? Is there any sense of what you should be aiming for?
Yeah, what's the vision? What's the like 30,000 foot vision of what we're doing?
And there isn't one, because the only one that we have right now is the history of dystopian science fiction, which is that, well, you shouldn't do it because it's going to destroy the world. But
And
then you,
that's a crappy myth too, ultimately, right?
and so you have all of these incredibly smart people whose greatest passion in the world is solving puzzles.
Great.
Awesome, right? You've collected some of the smartest people in the world, you've given them some of the hardest problems in the world, and they're solving them. And then you're like, okay, well, what are you solving them for? And they're like, I have no idea. I just solve puzzles.
Time for a vision quest, guys.
Yeah. And so, like, I wonder if this isn't a fruitful vein of discovery for people, of just being able to connect with this collective unconscious, to see some version of the future and to aim towards it in a way that they haven't been able to have, because the old religious mythologies seem kind of stodgy and no longer applicable and hidden under this veil of institutions and gold and priests and everything
Yeah.
else.
Yeah, you remind me of one of the things that Buckminster Fuller said, which was that you don't change things by criticizing what's happening. You change things by developing the better alternative.
Hmm.
People can see the vision of what you're trying to, where you're trying to go. That you need to create that, and then they'll shift. So we talked about this earlier: is what happens if you give up these fundamental beliefs, and then you're facing this anxiety from the unknown. You know, it's very difficult for people to live in that degree of uncertainty. But if you just say, hey, here's a better look at this vision, this is a better vision, then they can move from that. How many people stay in relationships that they know are not working because they don't know where to go next? They're not comfortable being alone, so they stay in something, and often they only leave when they've got some new relationship or something. So it's that the courage of being with the unknown and of being uncertain that I
So
think is really important.
it's interesting because that can go to pathological extremes too, right? You occasionally meet the individual who's like, I don't need anybody, and they live like some very quiet hellscape out on their own as well because they've sturdied themselves against it. And I wonder if it isn't possible in the psychedelic space to get outside of that balance as well, right? Because you do want to be comfortable with that moment of uncertainty where you don't know what to do. And you need to be able to sit with it. But you also need to have the faith that you're going to know what to do and you're going to actually move in that direction eventually. But if you get stuck there, like I'm a huge fan when you were talking earlier about sitting with anxiety and decision making. I actually haven't encountered that perspective in a while because I've always, or not always, but I've developed this sense that when there's a decision to be made, I should just make a decision and just go with it. And if I made the wrong decision, I'll just course correct later. But it's better for me to not have to be burdened by that anxiety because I won't be able to act and maybe, I'll miss opportunities and so forth. So I've kind of gotten away from that, I guess, that sitting with the uncertainty feeling, which is maybe I've gone too far with it. But I imagine that there's a window of which that's therapeutic and a window outside of which you get pathologies in either direction.
I think
And
that's
it kind
well
of,
read.
yeah, just in more in generally, like it would be interesting to get your perspective on the risks, like the downsides and the things that people have to be careful with about, bringing their mind into these new states.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I realize too, like when you lead an organization, sometimes it is better to make a decision than to just drift in this uncertainty. And if the decision is wrong, you try to learn from it and change. So that sometimes you have to make a decision under uncertainty and accept the fact that you could be wrong. But I think that the moment before you make a decision is where you need to delve deep into the uncertainty, because you want to make the best decision possible, even though you don't have all the facts. And so I think, yeah, you could say the downside is that you just get paralyzed. Analysis paralysis is what people are. You're just constantly analyzing something and you really don't know. And you end up, this is what I think a lot of people do is, but what you're really doing in that case is you're affirming the status quo. When you get stuck in this analysis paralysis, you're just things drifting as they are right now. So you're
Right.
actually choosing the status quo. And in those, so that's a danger. You could say at some point you need to just make a decision and see what happens.
And I think that a good practice also is just make the smallest decision possible in that instant too. If you're still being gripped by that feeling of uncertainty, it's like you can walk a little bit in the direction without, driving 20 miles down the road, if possible. There's very few decisions in life that are irreversible. Like there are a few for sure, right? Like, you get pregnant or, jump out of a plane without a parachute. I mean, there's things that you can't walk back on, but most of the things that we are gripped with anxiety about, you can make small decisions and move in that direction. And that gives you the flexibility to course correct, but also be moving forward, which is psychologically healthy, I think, for me at least.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, in a way, you're reframing things because the biggest failure is in those moments not to decide, to just equivocate and then just continue with the status quo. And so the decision to make a decision, um, even if you're not sure what it is, can be the right move, because then you will at least learn something as long as you're paying attention. But you can also do too quick, not enough in that uncertainty. This sort of, it's not directly, but you remind me of Einstein's quote where he was talking about how he spent like 40 years trying to prove the unified field theory, and he never was able to do it. And people are like, hey, you wasted your 40 years, the whole second half of your life, you wasted it. And he said, no, I didn't. I actually showed all the different ways that you can't prove it, so that there was something gained by seeing these paths lead in the dead ends.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's like a search space that you have to fill. I'm just as we're talking about this, I'm really struck. I've had a bunch of friends that have hiked the entirety of the PCT, and almost all the Pacific Crest Trail. It's the trail that runs from Mexico to Canada, and it's been really interesting for me to watch because almost all of them go on the hike after some kind of event has precipitated the need to make a decision. And their approach is, okay, I'm going to make the decision to hike this trail, and then when I get done, it will be clear to me what the next step is. And they get done, and the only thing that's clear to them is that they are no closer to figuring out what the next thing is, and that they really enjoy being outside. And so I think that there's a need to have some kind of guidepost or some kind of direction that you're aiming for as you make these decisions. And even for psychedelics, I think that, I think I've heard you talk about this, or maybe I read it somewhere, where if you take the substance and then you just don't ever think about what happened to you ever again during that experience, it doesn't have the same sort of long-term transformative effect that you hope for. And so it seems like, okay, so if you're going to take a substance that's going to increase neuroplasticity and change the direction of your life, you also have to have something that you're aiming for. And so what is that thing? Like, have you discovered through all of these years of research what that thing should be?
Well, I would say that the vision that I had when I was 18, that led me to focus my life on psychedelics, um, was in part from this book by Hermann Hesse, for which he ended up his whole work, but this was the sort of crowning jewel that he ended up getting the Nobel Prize for. and it was called the Glass Bead Game, Magister Ludi, the Glass Bead Game, and it's about a post-apocalyptic society that is formed in order to channel the competitive nature of human beings, but into this glass bead game, which was a game of music, mathematics, poetry, and philosophy, in a way, where you would try to make the most beautiful statements, beautiful, elegant statements about the nature of the world and the nature of life. So it was a way in which, how do you channel these energies that can be tremendously destructive into this kind of positive way after people have seen the apocalypse and the nuclear war. And in the book, though, near the end of it, it becomes so abstract, this glass bead game, that it no longer captures the passions of the people. And so the head of it, the Master Saludi, leaves this game because he realized it's not serving the purpose for which it was built.
Hmm.
But the vision for me was also, I would say, from Abraham Maslow. We talked about the hierarchy of needs, a little bit about belonging needs, survival needs, belonging needs, esteem needs. And many people have learned in school that in sort of basic psychology classes that self-actualization is the top of the hierarchy of needs, that you become your full self. You know, and in the last few years of his life, Maslow changed that, and he encountered Stan Grof and LSD research and psychedelics, and he changed it to be that sort of the pyramid top was self-transcendence. You become your full self, and then you go beyond yourself to realize you're just a small part of something much bigger.
Well,
And then you identify in that way. And so I think that's somewhat similar to the Copernican Galileo revolution, when people thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and now, you have to recognize that that's not the case. So I think we sort of think of our ego, each of us, our ego is the center of the universe, and then we need to move beyond. So I think there's a massive kind of consciousness shift that humanity as a whole needs to move towards. And so that was the vision for me, is how do we move this group consciousness, group thinking, so that even you could say somebody like Jung could have a premonition, like, or dreams like, this is going in this terrible direction, but maybe through these kind of discussions and enough people thinking in different ways, we can have a different kind of a future. And then to get to quantum, they're all different kind of probabilities of different kinds. Some maybe, and again, maybe you can explain this more than I can, but some of them are more probable than others. But how do you change that underlying probabilities? What can make those? And so this kind of shift to who we think we are. Now we're globalized. We've got the internet. We've got satellites. We've got um, global warming. We've got nuclear weapons. Individual solutions are no longer working, neither national solutions. We need more global. And how do we move in that way? So I think for me, the vision was society at peace, where we have these conflicts, but what we do is we kind of channel them in positive ways, and that psychedelics can play a role in that. Um, and then all the different ways to try to make that happen. So I think if people, um, well, one of the things I started by my talk at Psychedelic Science last month was to say that if your dreams and your visions are something you can accomplish in your own lifetime, then they're too small. That we need these multi-generational visions that take more than a single individual to develop, and take whole cultures. So I think we are at a dangerous crossroads, and as you say before, a lot of people just want to burn it all down. And whether that is the best way to something new to rise from the ashes, I don't think so. But sometimes that's all that people see.
I'm also struck by something you said earlier, which is that uh, the im- acceptance of psychedelic substances seems to be a non-political question.
Yeah, that we
So people,
purposely. Yeah.
and so it almost strikes me as that representing. Let me organize my ideas. Okay, so we have that Maslow changes his hierarchy of needs to say that the goal is self-transcendence, to find
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
larger that you belong to.
Yeah.
We live in a very politically divided time, and yet psychedelics are accepted and encouraged on both sides. And I'm like, are we not seeing that happen because this is now a mechanism by which people can transcend the self to fully sink into some belief system that is politicized? Because you said earlier that there's the idea that psychedelics were associated with these traditionally left leaning unifying belief systems seems to be contradicted by the fact that now it's this apolitical thing and it's
Yeah.
this administration that's brought them into the space. And I'm like, it almost seems like the future of the species right now is a fight about what kind of consciousness will win. And so the reason that psychedelics are accepted on both sides is because it is a tool that allows people to segregate into their team of consciousness that they prefer so that the battle lines are more clearly drawn. I know that that's like half-baked, but does that make sense? Shila's looking at me like I'm crazy. Well, okay, so I think that the culture war is a thing that's happening.
Yeah, I would say to answer your question, I guess that yesterday I had a conversation with someone who was identifies as MAGA, and yet he's a major ally in trying to move forward ibogaine research. And so my question is that, well,
Which just for people who are listening who don't know ibogaine, it's great for anti-addiction therapies, from what I understand.
yeah, well, particularly for opiate dependence because it removes the withdrawal. And so you go through a psychedelic experience, the things that you have been running away from or whatever into addiction come to the surface. You can feel connected, you can work through it, and you don't have the addiction. It's also really good for traumatic brain injury, for PTSD, for a lot of different things. Um, Timothy Leary said that if you want to be a bridge, one of the things you have to get used to is being stepped on. So I think that as we build these bridges of common interest in psychedelics across these partisanship lines, it's an obligation to use those bridges to bring up the issues on which you may disagree with. So after I had this conversation with somebody who I've known for quite a while, he's been a major ally. We have a lot of respect for each other, and yet I feel a need to kind of do some further questioning. What does it mean to him to be MAGA? Does he really want to arrest all these immigrants that are, undocumented people that are pillars of their community for 20, 30 years with American kids? So I think that this idea that psychedelics would make him more open-minded, how do you square that with still identifying as being MAGA? How could you possibly, with all the horrible things Trump is doing? Um, and yet, there he is.
Well, I mean, I can square that because if the idea is self-transcendence for a larger structure, you have to have a model of the other side or of all sides in a conflict that has a self-consistent container. And so there is a worldview that is about compassion and openness and inclusivity and, taking care of the weak and the downtrodden. And that is one worldview. And then there is another worldview that is more, Spartan and strongman and like very, the self transcendence is not in the direction of we are all one. The self transcendence is in the direction of, the mighty will rule and everyone must become strong and the weak should be culled from society, right? It's like, I think that that's what I'm trying to get at is that the self transcendence is it's a function of the group that you believe that you belong to begin with, because not everybody, we have a sense that there is a collective unconscious that we will all fall into when we are relieved of our psychological burdens. But I'm concerned that what really will happen is that we will discover that there are actually quite strong psychological rifts that these substances can divide people along. Because you said earlier in the conversation, you were like, I had this extreme experience where I realized that in my heart was Hitler. And this is like a common thing that I've come across where there's, I think that Jordan Peterson espouses this, that, like the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every single one of us. And I do not think that there is anything that could lead me to be the steward of a machine that systematically exterminates people. Like, I don't think that there's a drug you could give me. I don't think that
Have
there's...
you read Ordinary Men?
I have read Ordinary Men, but that's the thing. Like, there's a difference between being somebody who, under power of circumstances, by something that presses down from above them, pushes them into a terrible choice, versus someone who is creating that terrible circumstance de novo. Like, nobody's pushing down on Hitler to be like, hey, what we should do is we should just create the greatest death machine that man has ever known.
I actually think the idea came to him from one of his underlings, for whatever it's worth.
The point still stands, is that, like, I think that what we may discover as we plumb the depths of the human psyche is that there might actually be different types of people in the most foundational sense of their soul, where there are some types of people that wish to do violence, and there are some people that don't.
I don't think it breaks down along red-blue lines in that case. Like, I actually think that the red MAGA type people, probably a lot of them that I've met, would defend their anti-immigration policies as compassionate and humanitarian, because they think that what's happening with, like, the abuse of migrant labor, unchecked migration, like, look what's happened, slums cropping up in Berlin, and like they have rationalizations that are in some sense checked along those lines as well. I do think there's two forces dividing the universe, but I think that you'll find both breeds of that on either side of those divides.
And I think that you're right that simplifying it along like red-blue lines doesn't necessarily really fit the reality that I've seen. Like, have you been exposed to the horseshoe theory of politics?
Oh, that the far left and the far right sort of come together?
Where it's like, you see that I saw this most clearly during COVID, because you have two groups that have totally different perspectives on two key issues. One is vaccination and one is abortion. Both of them, at the fundamental level, are the exact same question, which is bodily autonomy. And they have stances that point in exactly opposite directions. The people that are pro bodily autonomy in the sense that, like, a woman should have access to an abortion are also like, everyone needs to absolutely get it.
Don't say that word on this podcast.
Sorry.
Good God, I'm about to bleep all these out later. YouTube won't let us use that word.
I was like frantically writing erase. But so they basically there's this psychological fracture, right? Where there's some kind of key feature of the political landscape that is being used to galvanize people towards some kind of action that appears on both sides in different forms and forces people to manifest some identical impulse, just in opposite directions.
Yeah, well, I guess it's, I would just complicate it a little bit to say that bodily autonomy for abortion or whatever, where that you have no, women have no obligation in the sense to have children to, contribute to other people's safety in a sense. On the other hand,
So this is crazy because I feel like I'm going to get targeted for saying this, but like, we don't have another way of making more people.
right.
So it's like, in some sense, like, obviously there's like this whole other structure of like women who have children need to be supported by the society, and there's lots of ways that they're not, etc. But there does seem to be like a fundamental biological obligation here that
In general, I would say, but not specific. And I would say for vaccinations, with this idea of having enough herd immunity in a way of different ways, so that we're getting back to polio coming back, and we're getting all these things coming back that we thought, measles, that were eradicated. So I don't know that it's. I see how you're framing it, which I can see that, but I think it's at least it seems more complicated to me, the idea of vaccinations. But it's also the case that vaccines can hurt some people. They don't help everybody. There are negative side effects and things like that. But um,
But it's
I
like the
think,
slogan of my body, my choice works in both frames in a surprisingly effective way. And I was
yeah,
fascinated by watching people on either side of this question use literally use the same slogan with
yeah,
absolutely no stirring of realization of how similar the thought process was, and realizing that it was just coded with a different set of beliefs. And you're absolutely right that it's more complicated, and you
mm,
can make the case that it's more complicated about, reproduction, the same way that you can make the case that it's much more complicated for herd immunity and everything else. But if you abstract away to 30,000 feet,
yeah.
it's like, to me, it's just really stunning where I feel like we are going to uncover, as we explore the mind and we really map these large social cultural currents. Like, I have a feeling that we're going to uncover something that is um, less palatable than at the heart of every single one of us is this flower child that wishes great unity and togetherness for the whole of the world. Like, I think that there's something else that's inside of people's minds. And so substances that help people transcend themselves and merge with whatever that impulse is may in the long run end up allowing people to merge with something that might not be great.
Well, you could say that one of Hitler's great strengths was helping people feel part of this big community of Germans that were all, and then they would be willing to sacrifice their lives and do all sorts of things. And if
And
you look at his rallies and stuff, there's kind of mystical elements to that.
there's like a whole weird mystical occult like psychedelic side of 1930s Germany that we've kind of periodically
Yeah, the
touched.
Rudolf Steiner stuff. I mean, the same. It's funny though because that is the sort of classic danger of psychedelics too, right? Like the Charles Manson type who just brainwashes everybody into doing whatever they want, right? That seems to be a persistent fear for people about what can become of these substances. I actually would love to just get your take on the cautionary side of
Yeah,
psychedelics as
yeah.
well.
I think you could also say the same thing though about religion in a way, in terms of sort of brainwashing people to believe certain things and stuff. Well, the cautionary thing I would say is very much related to where we've been approaching this idea that the cultural context or your fundamental beliefs make an enormous difference on how you interpret the experience, and whether it's used to make you feel um, somehow or other. You could have this whole thing about, I've had these, a lot of this was in the 60s too. I've had these psychedelic experiences, and now I'm more connected, more spiritual, and smarter than everybody else. I'm like in a, that you can't trust somebody that's never done this because you know stuff that they don't. So it can lead to this kind of ego inflation, um, at the same time that we're talking about ego dissolution.
Hmm.
So we see that, I think, in a lot of people who become leaders, you could say, of cults or religions. That one of the best examples, I guess, was Rajneesh, from Oregon, who, or at least Rajneepuram, who was very much,
Came to Oregon
yeah,
in defense of all Oregonians.
Yeah.
yeah, and was kicked out, ended up leaving, but became from helping liberate people to having an organization that was patrolled by people with machine guns that were extremely oppressive. And so something that started out in a way to liberate people became something, over time, as it got bigger and as more people got involved, it became something that was very oppressive. So I think the idea that if you had a psychedelic experience, somehow you are smarter and more knowledgeable than other people, I think that's a real danger. Um, the idea that these are substances that people um, can take too casually, they can be extremely disruptive in a way. So let's say that you do believe certain things, and then you have experiences that make you question that. That can be liberating, frightening. This living in this indecision it's very much challenging, and people could take it too casually. That these are party drugs, and I'm just going to do it to party. And then we have people talk about being very disruptive in different ways. Um,
I think that's where a lot of people too, especially of my generation and older, maybe encountered these for the first time. Was like somebody at a party was like, "Hey, I got some mushrooms over here," and it's like that's probably the worst possible place for you to have this deeply introspective, soul rearranging encounter with reality for the first time.
I also think that there's a tremendous risk of taking a substance that isn't what you think it is.
yeah, oh, yeah. Well,
Like,
that I would say is the drug war. So
oh,
the biggest cost, because that's all because of the drug war. If it weren't because of the drug war, we'd have access to pure drugs and we'd know what they were. Because they're underground,
hmm,
so it's a function of the social context that makes that risk. So, for example, Boom Festival in Portugal is the foremost example of a psychedelic friendly festival. It's like a week long camping on private land. Portugal has drugs that are decriminalized, but they also have thin layer chromatography, this group called Energy Control, on site, and they test the drugs so that people end up knowing what they're actually taking, because prohibition makes it so that these drugs are often adulterated with all sorts of other dangerous things.
Can we
Um,
talk about the origins of the drug war, like the actual metaphysical underpinnings? Is it rooted in some sense of compassion, like we gotta protect people from themselves, or is
no,
it?
no, I'm
Yeah,
really glad you brought that up. So the real origins of the drug war are about persecuting minorities. So it began 1880s, 1890s, something like that, in the U.S. against the Chinese laborers who were building the railroads. And what drugs did they do? Opium, And so the first drug laws were against opium. Now the worry is they're going to compete against others for low wage jobs, and so we go after them for their drug use. Um, Prohibition, you could say, of alcohol was driven by people that thought, oh yeah, we got to all these men that were getting drunk all the time, that they're a terrible thing. And, so there was a lot of, you could say, probably alcohol prohibition had more good motives, to try to help people in some ways. But it really misunderstands human nature, and that this idea that, and many religions, like in Judaism, there's prayers over the wine. The wine is a sacrament in the Christian religion. So these are spirit. Where does we get these are spirits? the- You know, so there's a way to try to harness these energies, and I think prohibition was a moralistic way, like we're going to stop people from doing all these things. So, but it built the criminal underground. It really ended up with Al Capone and gangsters and murders, and then they call it the Iron Law Prohibition, which is that um, dealers will go to more and more concentrated, powerful versions of whatever the substance is that's illegal, because you can smuggle more of it in a smaller space and it's stronger. So you go from coca leaves to cocaine, you go from opium to heroin. You go from, and then you get to fentanyl. You're always trying to make smaller versions that are more powerful. Um, so once we had the reaction against prohibition, within a few years, what we have is the Marijuana Tax Act. And so we have all these prohibition agents and we have this enforcement mechanism. Now they got nothing to do. And who's using cannabis but Mexicans and African Americans? So it was really about um, this sort of self-interest from people that get employment, from prisons, from all this. It wasn't really about stopping abuse of cannabis. It was, they even,
or even fear that it's this radicalizing substance that'll make you against the man or something. You don't think that there was anything
no, I
anything
don't think it,
psychedelic to it, really?
no, I don't think so. I think it was just this prohibition instinct from this culture that had tried prohibition from alcohol, had such a negative counter reaction, and then try it for cannabis. The In the end of the 1970s, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, was quoted by Dan Baum, who wrote a book about it, and he said the two main enemies of the Nixon White House were the civil rights movement and the hippies. And he said we couldn't criminalize their protests, but we could criminalize the drugs they were using, and we could use that to arrest them, to break up their meetings, to arrest their leaders. Did we know we were exaggerating the risks of those drugs? Yes, of course we did. So I don't think that at the core of it, one of the reasons that I would say we have Florida has turned Republican is because of the drug war, because of what's called felony disenfranchisement. So certain states that if you are arrested as a felon, you lose your right to vote. So we have enormous numbers of people with crack cocaine, with other drugs that were used, selective prosecution against African Americans and minorities and others, and then they lose the right to vote. To show you how important that is, the people of Florida actually, Florida's been very close in the Gore, Bush election. That was only, a couple hundred votes, but now it's way separated. But the citizens of Florida actually voted to end felony disenfranchisement. And the legislature created a situation where you have to pay all of your fines before you get the right to vote. And they wouldn't make it clear how much people actually owed. And then they would say, if you vote and you owe fines, then we're going to go put you in jail. It's a big thing. So the ability to take away people's voting rights has been a big part of the drug war in certain areas, where you go after certain groups that you think are going to vote in certain ways. I don't think that the drug war is really about drug abuse. It's about cultural fears. It's about persecution of minorities. Um, I think that we would be much, much better off if we were to move to a post-prohibition world where we had honest drug education. You talked about DARE. Well, what if you actually were educated honestly about drugs? I mean, yeah, you might not come up, or even sex education instead of abstinence only. Those, but then you'd have pure drugs. Then you'd have um, harm reduction techniques that would be used, that would be employed. There would be peer support. We'd train people about how to support each other when you're going through a psychedelic or any kind of a drug experience. We'd have treatment on demand, paid for by all the taxes that's being paid for by the people that are buying the drugs, because most people that use these drugs don't have problems with it. So you will have a lot of tax income to do that. But I think the drug war is so destructive that we should switch to a post-prohibition world immediately, and we'd be better off, even without all these other factors layered into place.
And
But I
we
think
wouldn't have to live with this weird internal contradiction too from our legislation in our state, which is like alcohol is totally fine, even though people obviously destroy their lives with alcohol all the time. Cigarettes are, maybe not cool, but you can still buy them at every gas station. Also, unquestionably killing tons of people, right? So on one hand, we're like, well, it's your choice. But then for some strange reason with these other sets of substances that nobody can really logically defend, they're put in this other bin. And I think that's kind of creates a really internally inconsistent and, as a result, very anxious society, which doesn't really understand its relationship to mind-altering substances in general.
Yeah, and I would say that there's also this this well religions wanting to be the gatekeepers of spirituality, not wanting you to have your own direct experience. That's the church wiping out the Eleusinian mysteries and all. But then I think a lot of it is based on our fear of ourselves, that psychedelics bring things to the surface. So other drugs do as well, but the fear that we're these unruly passions, and without civilization and rules, we're going to be rape and pillaging and plundering, and that we're scared of ourselves, of what comes up, and scared of the uncertainties, the questions that are raised. And I think that's valid in a way, but we need to be supporting people. Many people talk about how they've had a psychedelic experience and it's caused them to change their life direction or to change their job or to do something different. And that fear that you've made these compromises or something that you think are necessary to survive, and then the psychedelic will cause you to question it, or that we need civilization to keep these passions in check. And what happens if I'm, quote, out of control, or if I don't have this ego to keep me in place?
Do,
Um,
do you think that there's an aspect of almost purity testing the work that Maps and Lycos was doing in context of this fear of drugs? Because I was looking through the testimony of the at the FDA trial
yeah,
where there was a woman who is a scholar of psychedelic history, and she made this really long presentation about how MAPS is a cult.
yeah.
And I read through her entire presentation, and it was basically her evidence for it was that number one, the organization has the mindset that it is necessary to heal the world and that the people that are part of it are true believers of that mission. Where I'm like, well, that doesn't totally feel sufficiently culty because it feels like every single organization that's trying to accomplish something has that.
Cults are totally legal, by the way, if you pay taxes. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know what's wrong with cults, at least from a legal perspective.
But she also, I think that's an interesting point, which we should explore. But she also really didn't like the therapy modality, right? Because you guys use a lot of this internal family systems therapy approach. And there's some uh I think that there's more physical contact between the patients and the therapists as a
Not,
consequence.
not necessarily part of internal family systems or IFS, but yeah, she was concerned about touch, the role of touch, and also this idea that when you're under the influence of psychedelics, you are impressionable or influenceable, or you're no longer in your right mind and you can be manipulated, and that these therapists are forcing people to have difficult experiences, because we believe that's healing, and therefore we're forcing people, which is the exact opposite of the therapeutic approach, which is to support what's emerging. Um, One of the things, yeah, so first off, MAPS was like Scientology and Nexium. That's the
Yeah,
comparison.
that was her first thing. She was like, you should treat this exactly the way that you would treat a weird sex cult that was asking for approval to use psychedelic therapies. Where I was like, I don't think that the burden of evidence has been met for that.
No, but it was very effective. So in terms of um, raising doubts about the validity of the data. So, yeah, you could say that what's true is that we're passionate, we care about healing, we've seen healings, we believe it works, we've seen it work, therefore, we're incapable of doing good science. I think that was a big part of it, that you don't have clinical equipoise. Clinical equipoise means that you have no vested interest, you don't really have any beliefs, you're just dispassionately studying something for no particular reason, and you don't care the outcome, and that if you care about the outcome. So I think that what was the fundamental mistake there was to ignore the role of scientific methodology. Everybody has their biases, so yeah, I believe it works, I've seen it work, but does that mean that I've designed the study in a way that's biased? And that's why we designed it in association with the FDA. And the FDA selected the protocol design after 8 months of negotiation in the special protocol assessment. I think that the fears of um, touch, and that people are exploited. I think I don't think that's accurate, but that um, I think that there was this question about. Well, let me say that the Veterans Administration has done this study comparing two main therapies that are used in the Veterans Administration. One is cognitive processing therapy, CPT, and the other is prolonged exposure. And these are very difficult therapies these are non-drug therapies. And they did a 6-year study, 916 veterans. And what they showed is that in both cognitive processing therapy and in prolonged exposure, about half the people dropped out of the study because it was re-traumatizing. We don't know exactly why they dropped out, but we know that many of them said that confronting my trauma in this direct way that you're asking me to do over and over and over is re-traumatizing, and they just can't do it. So we've got a therapy that we've developed that has extremely low dropout rates, even without the MDMA, because there isn't forcing people to talk about the trauma at any particular time. We support whatever's emerging. People can go to happy experiences, they can go to sad experiences, they can go to traumas, they go wherever they want. We support them. So one of the things that was sort of conflated was when one of the therapists was offering resistance. So sometimes when people are traumatized, they're too scared at the moment to fight back, so they internalize it. So some part of the therapy, sometimes people will say, you can push against my hand, like if you want to, like, speak to the rapist or something like that, like you get, and so it's pressure, it's resistance. It's not pressuring them, it's offering resistance against the pressure that they are exerting in their mind. They're doing this to the person that or people that oppress them or that traumatize them. So one of the things that this woman said was that that's the same thing. There's no difference between whether somebody is offering resistance or they're pushing against somebody, that it's still oppressive. So I think that's fundamentally wrong, and it misses us. And she wasn't the therapist either, the one that was offering these critiques, as you said. So I think that there was just an opportunity to bring out all of these fears. But what my diagnosis of what happened there was not so much the critics, because that is the essence of science. Science is criticism. Science is disproving your hypothesis. Science is bringing up all the reasons why what you believe might not be true. So we actually need critics. The problem was, and this may be a bigger picture, but most of the years of MAPS, now we're in our 39th year, most of the years of MAPS, we were funded by donations, and we could focus on public benefit, and nobody was looking for what they're getting out of it. Over the last couple of years, because the amounts of money that we needed went up so much as you move into the phase 3 studies, because we'd helped create a sense that there's a pathway through the FDA. And now there's all these for-profit psychedelic companies, many of which were doing quite well in the stock market, at least initially. It became impossible for me to raise the rest of the money that we needed from donations. So we took money from investors. Initially, some very public benefit minded investors, but later less so. And so the supervision of the drug development moved from MAPS to Lykos, which was the public benefit pharmaceutical company that we created, that we no longer control. So we lost control of it as we got more investors. And one of the fundamental mistakes, if not the fundamental mistake, was that the more traditional pharma people that we brought in tried traditional pharma approaches for something novel and innovative.
Hmm.
And the traditional pharma approach that they tried was called quiet period. What they said is pharma companies don't respond to critics, year and a half or whatever more before even they get to the FDA decision point. We don't respond to critics. So we had traditional pharma people who didn't really appreciate the role of therapy, just wanted to be drug company, sell drugs and try to minimize the therapy. But when the critics began criticizing, there was no response. And then we had the most painful thing, which was the tail wagging the dog. We had the pharma company convincing enough people on the MAPS board of directors that we needed to follow the pharma company's traditional approach. And so when you do something innovative, you need to be constantly educating people about what you're doing. You need to be transparent. You need to be communication. When you withdraw from responding to critics, particularly in scientific journals, people think if you have not responded, then you have no response. Scientific journals are about back and forth, back and forth. If you give up, people think the last word, that's probably what's right. So what we had was a series of criticisms that were not addressed, and they just got bigger and bigger and bigger. That even the woman that you're talking about was looking to engage in a debate and actually published something in JAMA Psychiatry criticizing the therapeutic method in March of 2023. It wasn't until August of 2024 that the FDA said no. And there was no response. And MAPS and me were blocked from responding, and the therapists were blocked from responding. So I think that the public dialogue, you need to be proactively leading it when you're bringing something up from the underground, when you're doing something new. And when you don't do that, the other big thing was this idea of functional unblinding. Okay, so let's get to science. The law actually says, and science believes in the double-blind study, and that's to reduce experimenter bias. That you don't really know which treatment is which, and so you treat everybody the same. And so we had blinded independent raters that didn't know what condition people were in. So that was important. But there's really no good way to do double-blind studies with psychedelics, with something that's so strong that you know that you've taken it. It's very difficult to do this. And I had spent a lot of time on my dissertation trying to figure out how to deal with the double-blind problem. And I came up with the solution. And the solution was that inactive placebo, people can tell the difference between psychedelics, or active placebos that are not the drug that you're using will be able to be differentiated by both patients and therapists to some large degree, so that the best design would be therapy with low dose of the drug versus therapy with full dose. Everybody gets the same expectations. Everybody's getting MDMA, all of that. So we spent 16 years trying to figure out what's the ideal dose. So microdose doesn't work because you're not able to tell the difference because it's a microdose. You wouldn't know. But something a little bit less than the full dose doesn't work either because it will have such therapeutic potential. So you need to figure out where is the right dose that is high enough to cause some confusion, but not so high that it has therapeutic potential. You won't be able to tell the difference between the two groups. So we spent 16 years and we studied therapy with no MDMA, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30, 40, 50, 75, 100, 125, and 150. Classic sort of dose response studies across this large spectrum. And here's where we discovered, and this is the beauty of research, is that you put your theories to the test, and sometimes your theories are wrong. So my theory was not wrong, it was half right and half wrong. So what we discovered is that the lower doses did produce a certain amount of confusion, but they also made people uncomfortable. So the 25, 30, 40, 50 made people uncomfortable. They were activated, but not enough of the fear reduction. Then we discovered that the 75 milligram dose group in one of our studies that had 30 milligrams, 75 milligrams, and 125, this was in veterans, firefighters, and police officers. The 75 milligram dose group did great, actually better than the 125. Now, randomization made it so that the 125 people had more depression than the 75, but nevertheless, the effective dose was lower than we thought. And the lower doses that did produce some confusion, people still got better, but they didn't do as well as if they got therapy with no MDMA at all.
Hmm.
So that's where we went to the FDA and said, we'll give you blinding, but you're going to make our job easier to find a difference between the two groups. And we said the essential question really is, if you can do this with therapy, why bother add a drug? So we should be testing therapy at its most effective. And the double blind will not work, but it's not going to work that well either with lower doses, but there'll be more confusion. And we just said to the FDA, you tell us what to do. And the FDA said, we want you to use therapy with no MDMA versus therapy with full dose MDMA. So that's how we designed it. And we got the 8 months and we got an approval letter. And that was in the special protocol assessment process. That was in 2017. Started the research in 2018. And unfortunately for us, the people that we negotiated with left the FDA. And the new people came over and took over the division of psychiatry, and they were more traditional, more conservative. And they were like, oh, this functional unblinding, this is a big problem. But they were bound to, because the FDA had accepted that design, had chosen that design. But the way they framed things to the advisory committee was, we're dubious about all the results because of this functional unblinding. So that was one of the things that the pharma company didn't explain, how that design was developed, why the FDA chose that design. So when you do this quiet period and people start saying, oh, we don't trust your data because of this. Now, we also had Dr. Tom Loughran, who used to be the head of psychiatry products. He's the one that said the double blind doesn't work a lot of the time, even with drugs like SSRIs that are not psychedelics. Because when you report your side effects to the researchers, they can say, oh, you've got sexual function issues, or you've got this problem or that problem. You can identify what group they're in by the side effects. Therapies are never tested in a double blind way. So this VA study that I described, comparing cognitive processing therapy with prolonged exposure, that was not double blind, but people considered the results to be valid. You just can't blind those kind of studies. So the double blind is like a scientific ideal, but in practice, it doesn't work as well as we would like it to, for a lot of different reasons. So the FDA is more practical, and they're like, well, if you can help people, even though the double blind doesn't work, we're not going to trust any information that comes from a study that's not fully double blind. So one of the things about the FDA too is that you have to prove safety and efficacy, but you don't have to prove mechanism of action. You don't have to know why the drug works. So I would say that the FDA advisory committee and the transcripts that you read and those accusations, on the face of it, you think that's ridiculous. MAPS is like Scientology and Nexium.
Well,
For a
she
while.
used the example of, there was, and I was reading about this. So there was a lady who was in therapy with a couple, and then like she ended up living with them at their house on some isolated island, and then later she sued them for sexual assaults, and then MAPS got pulled into this because they were part of the progress or part of the program. And it's like, I think that there's also this other aspect of it, right? Which is people in vulnerable situations with substances that are seriously affecting their emotional landscape, suddenly finding themselves in situations where maybe they don't want to be, right? Like, didn't that have a huge part of it?
Yes, that really did. And what was sort of missed from that is that we've treated around 400 people. That did happen. That after the MDMA sessions were over, that a boundary violation occurred from the therapists, where the sexual abuse, you could say, began of this patient. And that's a bad thing for sure. And one case is too many. But that had happened around 10 years ago. And that was one case out of 400. And so let me give you another example. We had a group of researchers that wanted to study the role of touch in MDMA assisted therapy. And they wanted to review videotapes of therapy sessions, 15 of people that got therapy with placebo, 15 that got therapy with MDMA. And they wanted to just describe touch. So that was one of the other things, that people are going to be touched in ways that they don't like. Now, the pharma company, Lycos, refused to provide those videos. So they disarmed themselves from saying, we see there's an issue here. We're looking into it. We're responsible. We're going to try to develop guidelines for what touch is appropriate, what touch is not appropriate. and we see this issue and we're working on it. Instead, now, by the way, the researchers were willing to do it for free. And they were friendly. That this was not in any way like a trap or anything like that. But the company itself said, we don't want to have anything to be said anymore about touch. And this was well before the advisory committee, more than a year, about a year and a half before the advisory committee. That if they would have said, yes, we're studying touch, then they go to the advisory committee and say, hey, you're raising this issue of touch. Here's what we're doing about it. Instead, they sort of like an ostrich put its head in the sand and saying, we don't want to know.
Do you regret starting Lycos?
Well, this may sound weird, but I don't regret sounding Lycos, but I regret not putting me in charge of it.
Who did you put in charge of it?
Well, I was in charge of MAPS, but we had a different CEO in charge of the MAPS Public Benefit Corp and Lycos. So I could see a slow motion train wreck for like for example, the study of touch. I would have immediately. It took like 5 minutes for me to hear, yes, let's do that. The therapist wanted it done, but we could not persuade the leadership of the pharma company and the MAPS board. Here's what I do regret: the MAPS board abdicated our responsibility and said, "Oh, now we got all this investor money, and they want professional pharma people to do commercialization, and they'll run this company," but they ran it again in traditional ways. What I could have done if I would have been also the CEO of Lycos, of the MAPS Public Benefit Corp, is I would have overruled a bunch of these more traditional things, and I think it would have worked out much better. Because I have a sense of when there's danger, you don't run away. You try to look at it. You try to understand the risk rather than try to pretend it doesn't exist. So I think we had the traditional people saying, "Oh, we've seen these videotapes of this therapy couple cuddling this person. We don't want to have anything to do with touch. It's a vulnerability. And besides that, we don't know anything about therapy, and we just want to be a drug company." So I think I have a lot of sadness that what we've created with about $150 million of donor money was a company now that is not a model public benefit pharma company. That's really what I had hoped to create, something new, a model public benefit pharma company. So what we should have done when we created Lycos was to actually quantify what is public benefit and link it to salaries, bonuses, and stock options to the management. There was no direct way. What you incentivize is what you get. And so there was no, we
Can that be done at how is that done for people who are setting up companies who want to incorporate values going forward? Like, is that at this stage of bylaws of setting up the articles of incorporation, or?
So I'm so glad you asked that question. Yes, it's at the stage of the bylaws, and it's at the stage of, you can say we're public benefit, but what does that actually mean? So for example, one of the things that public benefit means to me, which MAPS did, is transparency. It's even more important now because we don't believe that decisions coming out of Washington are based just on science. There's politics involved. And the politics is not necessarily to be trusted. And a lot of things are not, we don't want to know. We don't want to know all these measures of climate change. We don't want to know all these things. So Marty Makary, who's the head of the FDA, just released what's called the CRL, the Complete Response Letter. These are letters that the FDA gives to pharma companies when they reject their new drug application. So Marty Makary just released these that went back quite a while for drugs that have subsequently been approved. So you can see what all the FDA concerns were. And this was radical transparency, which of course is one of the Burning Man tenants, but this is radical transparency coming from the head of the FDA releasing all these documents. Now, Lycos did not release the CRL that they got from FDA. And for a bunch of different reasons that I think none of them really made sense to me. But now the question is, this is a public benefit corp in name. On the website, it says transparency is a value, openness is a value. And so have they released the CRL to the public? Even though the head of the FDA says releasing these as public benefit, the answer is no. So transparency. So the way you start a corporation is you would say, okay, transparency means releasing all the communications between you and FDA or whatever the particular business is. And if you release 100% of it, you get this score. If you release 50%, you get this score. And then you add all the other public benefits, and then you have a numerical score, and you have to get over a certain percentage to get a bonus or to
Hmm.
get a stock option or something like that. So I think it
And
can
you
be,
can make those kind of immutable, like unchangeable pieces at the foundation of a corporation.
well, the board can always change it,
Yeah, that's the
but
danger.
you can set it up. So once we realized that we didn't have any of these, because we set it up where initially the nonprofit was 100% owner of the public benefit corporation. So it would still be run by the nonprofit in nonprofit principles. So we didn't really feel the need to articulate in a numerical way and link it to performance and to compensation ahead of time. And then once we tried to do that, all of it got rejected by the company. There's no
Hmm.
specifics whatsoever. So I think for people that really, and the public benefit corporation is a really good modification of capitalism in that what it means is you don't need to maximize profits. In a regular corporation, you maximize profits. In a public benefit corporation, you maximize public benefit, and minority shareholders cannot sue the company if you're not maximizing profits, which they can in a regular company. So what happened is that there was no third party standard for a public benefit pharma company. And it would have taken around $3 or $4 million to work with B Corp to develop a public benefit standards for a new industry, which we didn't have to spend. And so we incorporated in Delaware where you create your own evaluation. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
it's basically meaningless unless you create your own system. And so we tried to do that too late, and the
Mm.
pharma company resisted. And then they defined in their own mind public benefit downward. So public benefit means making MDMA into a medicine. I'm like, okay, well, how is that different from Johnson and Johnson? How is that different from any kind of pharma company or any company? You could say Exxon's public benefit is providing energy for people to power their lives. So all they have to do is provide it. Well, is that public benefit? What about all the externalities? Do you? So I think we've got that. I think is the main thing that we should have done ahead of time is quantify exactly what we meant about public benefit and then make it so compensation was linked to that.
I
And we
think
did
that's
not.
really important in setting up institutions going forward. I think we're at this moment in history, particularly in America, where we're looking at a lot of old institutions like they need an update. And I think this really intentional approach to the full extent of codifying it in foundational doctrine going forward and linking it to decision spaces in the future is absolutely critical. And honestly, I think the same thing is playing out inside of science as well. It's like, what are we trying to do here? What is the goal? The tech space too, we talked about earlier. What is the goal ultimately? Are we all trying to actually get fusion to happen on Earth? Well, then let's put that front and center as opposed to whatever approach we choose to go. It needs to be codified as the central pillar under
Well,
which
and
we
you
all
could
act.
even say that capitalism is like cancer. It's growth, unlimited growth, and that's cancer, and cancer ends up killing the host. So unlimited growth as an economic model ignores externalities. It creates more about profit than about purpose.
And the directionlessness is the cancerous part, right? It's like growing muscles is great. Growing a muscle-sized tumor on your arm is not great, It's all about where that growth is directed at the end of the day.
Yeah, because I think that I systems that aren't growing are by necessity decaying. And I think that the problem that comes with capitalism is what you said, that shareholders can sue a corporation for not maximizing profits. That's harrowing. I'm like, that's the basis of all of our problems. You need to be able to have the wiggle room to be able to do something that isn't just about squeezing every last red cent out of whatever thing you're trying to do. But as because we're talking about pharmaceutical companies, and I'm like, there does have to be some kind of system for rewarding people for the immense amount of effort that they have to put into producing these compounds, figuring out which ones work, going through the arduous, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of expenditures for actually getting it through approval of government agencies. We've come to a point where we've lost sight of the organizing principle, of the meaning of it, of the mission of it. And I think that I'm just always hesitant. My family came from the Soviet Union, and so I, by necessity, I hesitate to knock capitalism too much because I'm like, I have heard stories.
Well, it's the misapplication of the tool, and it's like,
When did they come from Russia?
So we moved in 1990. I was one.
Wow.
Yeah. We still speak Russian at home, and I text him in Russian and
Wow,
everything.
я говорю очень плохо по-русски.
Oh, у вас хороший акцент.
My relatives came from Russia around 1880.
Oh, wow, you've kept the tongue alive. That's good.
Yeah, well, I studied Russian in high school because I was growing up under the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was like, who are these people that want to kill us? The whole world could grow up, and so I sort of wanted to understand the other, and so yeah, I studied Russian in high school. One of my fondest memories was when I was 16 years old. My family sent me to Russia for the summer to study Russian,
Wow.
1970.
Where did
And
you go?
well, we were actually in Leningrad, in St. Petersburg, Duny by the beach. The school was there. We were in Moscow. We were in Samarkand and Tashkent, which was
Wow,
amazing.
that's
But
amazing.
I learned a super important lesson from my parents, which was, and I think this really played a role in my whole life, which was they gave me Jewish prayer books to bring to the synagogue. So in 1970, the height of the Cold War, communism, there was no religion. Religion is the opium of the masses. And so my parents taught me that there's these big systems that you can't change, but if you can do something little, you should do it. So even to bring two prayer books to the people at the synagogue was a way of fighting back.
you're lucky you didn't end up in the gulag.
Well, what happened was that me and two other guys, there was like 60 of us in this high school trip. We met some of these young Russian black market people who, keep in mind, 1970, we have psychedelics culture called counterculture in America. And so there was this big market to buy blue jeans, to buy button, anything that looked like came from America. So, and we took our cut. So me and these guys, we made thousands of rubles. And rubles were worthless outside of Russia, so that you couldn't escape with money, so that to keep people trapped. And so I did go to the synagogue in Moscow, and I said, I've got this thousands of dollars to give you, and I've got these prayer books. And the guy said, don't give it to us now. We're under observation, but I'll meet you at the subway station at this place at this time.
Whoa.
And I was like, hey, I'm just a stupid 16-year-old. If they catch me, they'll just ship me back to America. I don't think the case would be now. They'd probably keep me as a bargaining chip or something. But I did it. So I met this guy at the subway station and handed all this money and the prayer books. And so my first underground activity was against the Russians.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. I love that story.
But yeah, I think that it's a tragic situation now in Russia. So okay, maybe I'll ask you this question. I'm curious what you think. So I just came back from Ukraine. We're training Ukrainian therapists. It's still against the law to do research with psychedelics, but I just also came back from Beirut. We have a lot of projects in Israel. We're trying to treat people in Beirut right now. We're waiting to see if we can get an import permit to bring MDMA to the West Bank for a project with Palestinian therapists to treat Palestinian patients. So the question is, what about treating Russians? I mean, Russians are heavily traumatized as well. Would it be appropriate? Now, we're not being asked by Russians, and you cannot do research with psychedelic drugs in Russia right now. But we try to be on all sides of the conflict. So I've been trying to think: would I feel comfortable, helping Russian soldiers and others who got PTSD from what they've done? Would that the criticism that we've got from working with the military and the Department of Defense actually has just got money from Congress to do MDMA therapy for active duty soldiers with PTSD. So are we making war more likely, reducing the consequences of war by treating PTSD? Is that somehow, are we contributing to something evil? Or are we helping people who are suffering, who themselves have often been?
And maybe who knows, some of it will end up in Putin's coffee, and then world peace is achieved. Yeah.
I mean, I think that the people that are on the grounds of battlefields are not the people that have fomented war. They're the ones who suffer. Like there was an exceptional Russian writer who wrote about the war of in Afghanistan, and the book that she wrote was called "Zinkovые мальчики," which is like the zinc boys. And so she writes about these, young men that are just sent to the meat grinder of war, and they have no idea what's waiting for them. They have no choice to get out. They're just on this horrific campaign where they have no weapons, they have no supplies, they're just wandering this horrible place committing atrocities. And her thesis was that these people are broken by a machine that forces them into unimaginable circumstances. And I think that that's kind of what all of war is, right? It's people sitting in boardrooms that will never be at the front, that are making decisions that rip the fabric of the world apart for generations. And so helping people on all sides of that seems like it's the most humane thing to do, because all of us
Plus,
suffer.
mandatory psychedelic experiences for all world leaders. I'm a big fan of that program.
Shiloh's really right about
I
that.
just put something in the chat. This was something that happened in the 80s, which was we managed to send a bunch of MDMA. This was during the Reagan-Gorbachev arms control meetings. We managed to send a whole bunch of MDMA into Russia around a lot of the scientists and others working on nuclear weapons. And so we kept it quiet for a long time, but this is a story from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists about our trying to bring MDMA to Russians at that time to sort of help them process their trauma. There was kind of an overlap at Esalen between, there was what was called the Soviet American Exchange Program that was called Track 2 diplomacy. So when the leaders are sort of at odds with each other, if you bring civil society, people that are still connected to power but are not those people, that they can maybe build bridges and talk to each other in a way that you can create more mutual understanding. So there was this Soviet American exchange program happening at Esalen at the same time that we were having these meetings at Esalen to defend MDMA as the DEA moved to criminalize it. And so we had some crossover between some of the different people, and some of them were willing to take MDMA back to Russia. So that's sort of how that happened. But I actually think, and this is to get back to this idea of consciousness change in a mass way, that it's not about the leaders. It's really about the masses of people that give away their power. There will always be psychopaths who want to be in charge of things, and they get a lot out of it in their minds. But the people that give away their power are the ones that they're doing it out of fear. They're doing it out of anxiety. They're doing it to belong to an identity, but they're not getting as much. So I really think that we do need more enlightened leaders for sure, but we really need to elevate the consciousness of humanity as a whole. We call it, spiritualized humanity, mass mental health. Those are the real goals. So earlier we talked about vision. So what's the vision that animates me, which is, can we have humanity as a whole that is more spiritualized than fundamental, more mystical than fundamental, more. And I think the irony here is that the more you are sort sort of from this mystical approach, the more you can appreciate different kind of religions. It's not that you um, have to give up your own religion or you have to, have one world religion or anything. The more that you can see how it's like language. I mean, you can speak Russian, we can speak English. It's not like Russian is better than English or English is better than. They're different. They spring from the same place of trying to communicate using local words. I think religion springs from the same place of how do we understand life and death? How do we understand meaning and purpose? And there's different cultural ways. And I think the more that you can um, be part of the sort of universal aspect of it, or the humanity, the more you can appreciate different ways that it's being expressed, rather than think, oh, I can't go for that because you're saying that there's a different prophet than my prophet.
Mm.
So I think it's paradoxical. The more we can be um, understanding our commonality, the more we can appreciate individuality. And that's what we need, is really a spiritualized humanity in order for us to move forward. But in order to do that, we need more equitable distribution of resources. When people are, we get back to the Maslow hierarchy of needs. The bottom is your survival needs. So let's talk about people in war zones. They don't have a lot of time to think about anything but survival. And they think about, here's the enemy, here's people trying to kill me. So
Yeah.
it's hard. So you're focused. So we need to get more and more people up from survival level. That's where I talked about people in America that can't afford $500 unexpected expense, to get them so that they can start focusing on belonging needs, self-esteem needs, self um, self-actualization, self-transcendence. So that we've got enough resources in the world. They're just unduly concentrated in the 1%. They need, so if we had more
And spiritual resources too, right? Like this idea of decentralized vision, where people are able to cultivate their own ability to access, the true nature of reality, as particularly as it relates to the future. If everybody has a better sense of vision, then you don't have to rely on just some, savior to come and mop things up for you. I like that a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it would be incredible to live in a world where people weren't driven by fear and anxiety. And
Yeah.
anything that pushes us in that direction, I think, is pushing us towards a more interesting world, because the stuff that's out there right now just seems so obviously driven by the worst angels of our nature, that a path towards finding a little bit more equanimity in the decisions that we make is one that I really support. And I really appreciate that you've spent so many years working on this and you're still so driven and so enthusiastic. And I love that you're out in the world, Rick.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's been incredibly healing to be in Beirut. To say that my Israeli relatives were in Lebanon as well a few weeks before I got there, but part
Mm.
of the Israeli army.
Oh, wow.
And so I felt like here they were coming with guns and bullets. I'm trying to come with MDMA. And it feels like trying to do this project with Palestinian therapists, with Palestinian patients in the West Bank. I feel that Israel is in the grip of terrible fundamentalists and super right wing people, and they're destroying the real values of Judaism. They've lost the plot. So it's just really painful. But to try to do, I think from what my parents taught me, is that if you can bring two prayer books, at least that's something, and that's more than nothing. And once you feel you're doing something to contribute positive, then that's sort of self reinforcing. You're not helpless. You're not giving up.
Amen.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that being able to do this in war zones and helping the people that are so deeply impacted is it's just really noble. I hope that it succeeds. I wish you the best
Thank
of luck with all ventures.
you.
Yeah, Rick. Well, I guess we've gone actually over our appointment, so the
Oh,
fears, any trepidations about us uh, being
no,
able
this
to
has
talk
been
for 3 hours seem to have evaporated. So
Yeah,
I hope you had a good time hanging
sure.
out. It was wonderful to spend this
I did.
time with
Have
you.
you spoken to Bruce Dahmer by any chance?
We
Yeah, we've
have.
been to his house.
Oh, good. Okay.
We
Because
should probably get him back on, actually.
Oh, because he got into psychedelics
yeah,
after
we
we
were
saw him.
right. We were talking
Yes,
about
yes,
origins
yes.
of life.
Well, yeah, he's got Mind. Minds is about psychedelics for scientific creativity, and he's been in touch with some of these people that have used DMT to figure out physics.
Well, that would be interesting. Yeah,
Right.
you said you had some physicist recommendations at the beginning, and maybe
Yeah.
we'll email you about that if you know.
Well, I'm not sure. Again, it's the same thing about Jung. I'm not sure if this guy is ready to be public where he got from this DMT experience, but Bruce is willing to talk about a lot of that.
We're into cool physics, even if he doesn't want to talk about
That's true. That's
the
true.
psychedelic
Yeah.
basis of it.
But then the other person is Hartmut Nevin.
Mm-mm.
We haven't talked about him yet.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so Hartmut Nevin is quantum computing for Google. He's one of the top guys for quantum computing. But he's also super interested in ayahuasca. And he ended up wanting to give back to this ayahuasca community. And so MAPS became a fiscal sponsor for them to route funds to MAPS and then get tax deductions, and then for us to set it down to this ayahuasca community in Peru. So I think this idea between psychedelic states of mind and quantum thinking, if he'd be willing to talk to you, Hartman would be incredible to speak about that. And he's tried to teach me what it means, quantum computing and stuff, and how it works. You know, it's of course mind-boggling.
Yeah,
but
we've had a couple of conversations. We hung out with a Yale professor
Steve Gervin.
a few months ago who was working on this. I think the application space is really what's lacking. So it seems like vision would be, in some sense, the highest. What is it? It's the biggest deficit. It seems like, right? Because it's a special type of computing that doesn't seem to work for, balancing your checkbooks or whatever computers are used for most people.
okay, I just put his email in the chat as well.
Excellent.
Cool. We'll check it
So
out.
Check him out.
I think he would be really terrific if you could speak to him at length.
Very
That would
cool.
be great. I mean, this has been really fun. We come through Boston periodically, and we're down in San Francisco a lot. And so, if you wanted to meet up and get a cup of coffee, and
Oh, well,
talk
I would
shop.
love it. So what I've lately been doing is taking a lot of meetings, going in the woods with our dog by McLean Hospital, so we could go for this beautiful walk in the woods. Whether it's winter or summer, it doesn't matter.
We have some of the most amazing woods in the whole universe, I think, out here in Oregon too. So if you ever find yourself driving down the 5 and you need a break, we would love to take you on a hike out here as well. And I mean that in all seriousness. We've actually had a number of people that I didn't think would stop by who have taken us up on it. So I'll put it out there.
I cannot speak highly enough of this strange place that we live. It's barely inhabited and wild, super strange biology. It's like one of those
crystal clear rivers, and you can get very far from humanity very quickly
in like 45 minutes.
Yeah.
You're
Wow.
just out.
But yeah, we'll definitely hit you up next time we're in Boston. So
Yeah,
we
please
were
do.
just out there.
All right.
But I guess we'll let you get on with your day. Thank you for making the time for us. And
When are
giving
you going to put this out?
I think we'll get it out next week. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I'll shoot you an email before it goes live.
Okay. Yeah, please do.
Awesome.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you so much.
До свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания.
Bye, everybody.